Going over the stuff of pharmacology, and I'll give you a little bit of a, what's a nice word for it, warning, precursor, intro, whatever you want to call it. We are going to skim pharmacology. Later on, you might think that, well, hey, taking a pharmacology class in college would be a great thing. Can I get college credit for this class? Well, you kind of already are, because you're getting, probably about 1 of the 4 credit hours for this class comes from pharmacology. The other part of it is, it's not necessarily a pharmacology class. Go take a pharmacology class. It's like students who think, well, I went through paramedic school. Shouldn't that count as A and P? You think this should count as A and P? No. Yeah. It's ain't nothing near A and P. So this is really not pharmacology. It's skimming of pharmacology. I highly encourage you to go take a pharmacology class. We have them here. They're 2-hour college credit classes. That's not a bad one. What I would really encourage you to do is go take the bachelor's program at UT Southwest or UT Health Science Center San Antonio. You'll take 2 3-hour classes in pharmacology and you'll really understand pharma. Better than nurses who don't really understand it. Which I will actually give you more information about that program as you get closer to finishing your associate degree, because that's really the next step, is to go take that. All right, so we're going to look at just the very basics of what pharmacology really is. We're going to do this kind of in 3 steps tonight, and we will not finish this entire packet tonight. Never have, never intended to. Just I don't know where to put it in with tomorrow night, but we'll finish up tomorrow night, and then it's a shorter lecture. So we're going to look at just the general process of pharmacology and how then drugs work. And then we'll start talking about individual systems and how those things apply to drugs. First of all, definition of pharmacology in its simplest terms is this is simply the study of drugs and their actions on the body. What happens when I give someone this chemical? What do they do? Because all drugs do something. It doesn't really help to get a drug that has no effect, right? What did this water do to you?
Hydrated.
Well, actually, it hydrated in some ways. A lot of people look at it and say, well, it didn't make me high, it wasn't an upper, it wasn't a downer, it wasn't a this, it wasn't a that. You take water actually for nutritional purposes more than pharmaceutical purposes, but it does have a purpose. When we look at a drug is defined as a chemical agent used to either treat, prevent, or diagnose a disease. All right, most people can think of a drug and say, well, it treats something. Give me an example of a pre-hospital drug that we might use to prevent a disease.
Immunization.
It's not pre-hospital, but yes, that would be correct.
Would you do like D10 to prevent, worsening of a disease?
Don't think too complicated about this.
Oxygen.
Bingo! Why do we put oxygen on most people?
Keep from being hypoxic?
To prevent the hypoxia, to ward off the ensuing shock. We use hypoxia as a preventative agent as much as we do a curative agent. So that's a preventative thing. Other preventative things are exactly what we said. Immunizations, those are helping to prevent diseases. When you come in contact with somebody, we give you a drug that prevents you from getting that next disease. Can you think of a drug we might use to diagnose a disease?
TB test.
TB test. The drugs that they use when you go to get an x-ray, they say we want this with contrast. So they start to they push this radioactive stuff in your bed so you glow for 2 or 3 nights. But all that does is it helps them diagnose something. Even though it doesn't do anything itself, it helps the diagnostic process. Have you ever had allergy testing? They roll over on your stomach and they make 200 little circles, number each one of them, and then cat hair, dog hair, dust, pollen, 900 things that they scratch in your back. And what are they looking for?
Reaction.
Yeah, they'll see that's so scientific. How do you know you're allergic to cats? Well, you get a cat. Pretty simple. That's a diagnostic process. We actually use this in some cases, and it shouldn't be used today because it's just dumb. We have better tools. We used to use naloxone as a diagnostic tool. Naloxone is used to treat what? Anyone know? Also known as Narcan.
Oh, yeah. Overdose.
For narcotic overdose. Right now, the FDA wants to release it as an over-the-counter drug you just carry around with you. So when your friend overdoses, you just give him some.
Oh, that's
They
smart.
want it in an auto injector.
That's
Yeah, 'cause
Does it
that's
come with
gonna
a bark
make it safer. I personally think your friend overdoses on it, he should go away and you just get better friends. But that's a diagnostic process. We have a drug called adenosine that people want to use to treat supraventricular tachycardias. Well, all it really does is make the supraventricular tach go away. As soon as the drug wears off, it comes back. They didn't really treat it, just told you what it was. Now we need another drug to actually fix it. Okay, so we have lots of things that actually fit into those categories, and that's really all a drug does. Would you want a drug to do anything else? I mean, that's kind of it, right? When we look at what drugs do, we have to be very realistic. Why is there a drug that doesn't automatically just make you taller and a better dancer? Well, for that to happen, what we really have to do is have something that's capable of altering a cell function. Okay? White cells don't dance. That's just it. Get over it. So what happens with this? Is there something we can do to alter a cell function to make you taller and a better dancer? Is it going to happen? Maybe not. But if we know that you have a problem with the pituitary gland, the pituitary gland is in high gear, could we give you a drug that might lower the pituitary function? Or if it's in low gear, could we speed it up? So essentially it's a switch, turns it on, turns it off, makes it faster, makes it slower. And this is occurring under normal physiologic conditions. So under the normal circumstances, we simply take a cell or a group of cells or a cluster of cells and try to make them act a little different. Now the problem is what it does to one cell may do something else to another. And that's our problem. Half the time we look at, I want to make this cell do better, but it's going to do this to this cell. And we have to live with it. What happens, what do we call the ones that happen to these cells? Side effects. Are they bad?
Sometimes.
Sometimes they can. Most of the time they're more of just a nuisance. You know, you have itchy, watery eyes. They say, here, take this antihistamine. It'll make you better. What's the downside?
Drowsy.
You're sleeping. So you feel better, but now you're tired. Which I just think, go to sleep. When you wake up, the owls will be gone anyway. One of the things everyone wants to think about is how safe drugs are. And we really don't have safe drugs. When we look at what would an ideal drug be, well, it's not there to begin with. We don't have a perfect drug. I mentioned most drugs turn this thing on, well, they turn this thing off. That's bad. We don't have safe drugs. Okay, here's something you can use your writing instrument and write down. All drugs in overdose cause respiratory depression. All drugs. Even oxygen in overdose will make you stop breathing. Right? Have you heard that before? Anyone here a scuba diver? Why don't you breathe oxygen under pressure?
I don't remember.
Because it's an overdose. It's more oxygen under pressure, it makes you stop breathing.
You said respiratory depression.
Respiratory depression leading into arrest, and what's that other D word? Oh yeah, death. If we had a perfect drug, we'd have one that had perfect effectiveness. I give it to you, it does exactly what I want it to do. It would be perfectly safe. Oops, I get 10 times as much as I was supposed to, no worries. It would have selectivity. In other words, I want it to make you taller, but you're already a good dancer, so that's fine. All it does is tallness. Or, you're a great dancer, but you're tall enough. Last thing we need is someone 6'4" being taller because I gave him a better dancing drug, right? Because you've ever seen a 7-foot tall person try to dance? It's not pretty. The other things it would have is have reversibility. You have, oops, let me take that away. It would have predictability. I know exactly when it's going to take place. I know exactly when it's going to end. It would have ease of administration. Like, here, just sniff this. It would have no drug interactions. In other words, I could give it with any other drug, and what would it do? Do the exact same thing it always has done. The other drug would have no effect on it. It would have chemical stability, which means I could make it today and it would last forever. It would have a simple generic name. Have you seen all these drugs on TV now? It's like they mix 9 consonants together because they've run out of vowels and they still expect you to be able to pronounce it the first time. You don't think that creates confusion for physicians? I mean, there are people out there taking Xanax and Zantac. Same thing, right? Yeah, if you don't know them, go look them up. They're a little different. So we don't have an ideal drug, and that's one thing we need to realize. Every drug has consequences. When I give a drug to someone, including oxygen, there's a downside. And we have to understand what those things are. A lot of the information you'll find about drugs comes from very simple places. Well, I say simple. They're simple to me. What I want you to think of is if it's simple, it sucks. That's not a bad way to put it. It has a high vacuum potential. The simpler it is, the more it's going to, bring in the atmosphere around it. We really don't do well by learning very little about drugs. Now the problem is these ones that are very detailed, like the hospital formula. This is my favorite one. This book's about that thick. This thing comes out, this one's 2009, I need to take a bigger picture. But they come out every year with a brand new one. And I have never, one time, looked for a drug that wasn't in there. Only one time I looked for a drug in there and it wasn't in there. And it was just a new drug. It is very well done. It is put out by pharmacists who actually study the drugs and say, here's what we know about the drug. The one everyone loves, and I can see this in ambulances, you'll find this in almost every emergency room sitting somewhere, is the physician's desk reference, the PDR. And these, what's a nice way to put it, suck in the atmosphere around it. They just engulf nothingness. Everyone loves them, but I dare you to find 10 drugs that are in that drug. List 10 drugs and then go find all 10 of them in there. Because it doesn't put every drug in every year. You have to have 3 or 4 years of it to find every drug. And what really is in there is really nothing more than drug inserts. What are drug inserts?
What the company that made the drug puts in the...
Yeah, a lot of times you open up a brand new bottle of drugs and you can't get the bottle out because there's this folded piece of paper. The first thing you look at is, that's nasty, must be packing, so you throw it away. If you open it up, what do you find?
A lot of information.
This big long folded sheet that's about this long, written in 4-point font, but it's all the information the manufacturer knows about the drug. They give that information to the physician's desk reference people and they put it in there. Why is that so much different from what's in the formulary? Formulary was put out by who? Pharmacologists. People actually studied the drug in different ways. Manufacturer's impression,
They want to sell it.
non-biased opinion. They're not always the same. And that's something this is so nice. You get really good information. So these give us everything that we know about drugs. Really good information. It may be way over your head from a chemistry level, from a pharmacokinetics level, from a pharmacotherapeutics level, but the more you understand drugs, the better off you'll be. Okay, I don't think the people who wrote it understood most of it. But it definitely is going to give you really good information. And information much better than what you find in some of these things. First of all, nursing drug references should not apply to you. Why not?
It's not nurses.
You're not nurses. You know what these tell nurses? When the doctor orders this drug, make sure it isn't given with this drug because that something bad will happen. Do nurses understand drugs? Not as much as they'd like you to think they do. Because a nurse doesn't have to make a decision about giving a drug, do they? Who made that decision?
The doctor.
The doctor. You're in a different boat. You've got to decide whether or not this person needs this drug or this drug. You're going to have an opportunity to decide what drugs are used to treat your patient. Pocket guides are really great in case you need a guide to a pocket. But why is this called a pocket guide?
It's in the pocket.
Because it's little. It's really small. How much information can you get in that? Oh yeah, look, it comes in a blue box. Okay, that's knowledge. Online references are great, and I used to really have a hard time with online references, and I still do, because have I shown you my phone?
It's all good.
If you flip this up and say, Spock, beam me up, actually, if you hit 10 digits, you can talk to somebody. That's all I care about with this phone. I see other people get this thing, and they try to find all kinds of junk on it, like cat videos, so important. But there are apps now that you can actually look up the stuff You could take out your phones. The only decent use of it on a clinical would be to pull the thing up and go, okay, Xanax. Oh, it is different than Zantac. They does two different, completely different things. So those have a good process, and they have been morphed into the simple apps. Now, I have no idea, and I should be honest with that, I don't even care what the difference is between an online reference and an app. I'm not really sure. I think apps were sold because someone couldn't spell application, but what they really meant was it's an online thing. Is there really a difference? Yeah, I don't know. The thing that we find, even ones that we find out like drug guides for paramedics. See this one? This one's the pocket reference, and this one's put out by Bledsoe, so it must be good, right? A lot of these have got minimal information. There's a book out there by a guy named a guy named Guy. He's a good doctor. He's the burn physician for Vanderbilt University. He's also the medical director for a lot of the paramedic programs in the Nashville area. He put out a great pharmacology book, except that it's full of flaws. If you look up aspirin for the treatment of pain, it will tell you that aspirin inhibits coagulation of blood cells. Is that right?
No.
Well, if you look under why we use it for angina, that's exactly what we use it for. Didn't translate when you decided, let's put the same information there, why we would use it to treat pain. It's a whole different process. But see, that's the thing, with abbreviated stuff, they don't think through the whole thing. So what I would encourage you to do is go back to the formulary, because it's got all kinds of really neat information. This is what you'll find in a formulary, and you don't have this because even if I printed this in there, it'd look like little white lines, so I didn't even leave it. When you look at what's in a formulary, you're going to have all kinds of stuff in there. You'll have the uses of the drug. More often than not, we use drug for one thing. There are other things it could be used for. And what are those? It'll have precautions. You know, if this person is blue, what kind of things would happen in that situation? If they're on certain drugs, if it's the wrong time of day, if they've just eaten this, it'll have all the warnings. It'll tell you the stability. You know what's in most drugs as far as stability? They're only tested at room temperature. We have no idea what these drugs do. Most drugs, we have absolutely no idea what happens when they're outside in an ambulance in freezing temperatures for long periods of time. Or what happens when they're out in that hot ambulance with the wonderful air conditioner that cools down to 105. I have no idea what they do. Interactions is what?
With other drugs.
Interact with other drugs.
This drug with this drug. If I give this drug, if I give sodium bicarb along with my calcium chloride, what's going to happen? Anyone think about what might happen if you put calcium and
chloride?
bicarb together?
They would counteract each other.
Now, I used to have a really good way of doing this. I'd turn around and pick up a piece of chalk and throw it at you and say, you make this. But you don't make a dry erase marker anymore. The world has changed and taken away a lot of my fanfare. But essentially, you put calcium chloride and sodium bicarb together, you get calcium carbonate, which is chalk. And it precipitates into chalk in the blood. Bad thing. What's the pharmacology of the drug? What is its stability? What is its delivery way? How does it get absorbed? How does it get eliminated? How does it get distributed? We get dosage and administration. How do we give it? Can it go IV, IM, IN, PO, OB, up butt? I guess it'd be UV. All the different ways we could give a drug. Can it give it that way? Because not every drug is a drug in all routes. Sometimes they're useless in one route as opposed to another. So it has all kinds of information. And you'll find all that here. We're going to use as an example a drug called acetaminophen. Okay, you probably heard it as acetaminophen. Y'all heard of acetaminophen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what do you know it as more commonly?
Tylenol.
Tylenol. So here's a drug called acetaminophen. You know it as Tylenol. It's an analgesic antipyretic, a miscellaneous one. In other words, we don't know exactly where to put it. But we all know this drug, right? Everyone knows acetaminophen. You have a headache, you take 2. That's it, right? Oh, it's kind of red and white. But look at all the information that we use it for. Here's for pain, here's for varying types of pain. We look over here, we're still talking about pain. Oh, here's for fever. We might use it for a few other things. Here's for febrile seizures. Here's dosing and administration, how we give it, what the dosages are, adult doses, pediatric doses. Here's some cautions, things that are kind of worrisome. Some precautions and considerations, pediatric precautions, because kids and livers and Tylenol, they don't really go together. Drug interactions, what happens if you take with alcohol, with anticonvulsants, with aspirin. I can't tell what that is, but there's something else there. And a few other different types of things. What happens as far as laboratory tests? Can you find it? That's a good thing. So, we can't find this once you give it to the drug. That's a good drug to want to kill someone with, but it may not be beneficial to your patient. What about toxicity? When does toxicity occur? I like this. Here's toxicity. Oh, this is toxicity. Oh, this is toxicity. Here's a graph. That doesn't look good. Not sure what you think. You take it over a few days, you're dead. But more toxicity. A little bit more toxicity. Here's chronic toxicity.
Oh.
In other words, I didn't take 90 of it one time. I just took, instead of 2 a time, I take 6 a time. So over time, I developed these big problems. Here's the pharmacology, what it's made of, how it kind of works, the pharmacokinetics, how it moves through the body, its chemical stability, and then all of the different ways acetaminophen might be prepared and sold and marketed. Oh, wow, look, and some more, and finally we get it here. Okay, here's that. So how many pages did we look at just on acetaminophen?
It's like 5.
We got, let's see, let's just call them columns. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 and a half columns just on acetaminophen. The sad thing, if I was to show you epi, there's 3. Okay, not quite that few. It's sucks pretty bad. I shouldn't tell you that there's only one drug I have. I actually can't find oxygen in here either. It's not in here. Which I've written them about, by the way, because I get bored. So those are really good references. When you get a new drug, I would recommend you get out a physician's desk reference or a PDR or the drug insert and read about the drug. Because the physician may have ordered it, but you're responsible for knowing what it does for every drug you carry in your ambulance. Dallas Fire Department carries 11 drugs. MedStar carries about 112. Okay, maybe not that many. They took the trailer off. They had the small pharmacology. Anyone remember what MedStar? Anyone work over there knows? I think they were close to 70 at one time. So if you're really lazy, you go to work at Dallas. If you really want to be a good paramedic, stay in Tarrant County. All right, as we look at the study of drugs and how do we see drugs, we look at drugs in several ways, and one term that we use is therapeutics. This is how we use a drug to actually treat people. We refer to this as pharmacotherapeutics. In other words, what is the drug really used to do? This is its use in that process of diagnosing, preventing, and treating a disease. Okay, what do we use it for? Now keep in mind, I have a medical use for cocaine. That would be its pharmacology or pharmacotherapeutics. Can I also abuse it? That's not this. The medical use of a drug is not pharmacotherapeutics. That's actually called use. We also have a term called pharmacodynamics. Pharmacodynamics is the study of a drug's actions and effects of the body. Think of dynamics. Superheroes are active, right? They have action. They're in action movies. So dynamics is actions. Pharmacokinetics, what's kinetic energy? Energy of movement. Okay, kinesiologists study movement of the body. So movement is kinetics. So pharmacokinetics is the study of how a drug moves through the body. How does it get in through absorption? How does it move about? How does it change who it is? Drugs don't like to be who they are, so they always change. And then how does it get out? Most drugs we want out of the body. Okay, even antibiotics. People think, well, I don't want an antibiotic to leave. Yeah, you really do. Or not, what's the other one? What did you say? Vaccines. Do you want a vaccine to leave your body? Well, the drug itself, yes, you want out. Your body will recognize something in there and build its own immunities. So the drug still needs to go away. If it doesn't, we have a problem. You know, imagine, you know, morphine staying forever. You may walk around pretty happy. What's going to happen when you sit on a nail? Yeah, nothing. Well, except there'll be a nail in your butt, you won't know that. So dynamics is actions, the action process. Kinetics is movement, how it gets about, you know, in and out. Where we get drugs is really kind of variable. We really have only four places that we can get a drug. And let's just start back in ancient history. You know, Grog's out hunting dinosaurs. He's got his woman got by the club, dragging her by the hair. You know, all the things we know so well about Neanderthal people, because we know all that really happened. You really think the first use of drugs was therapeutic? No. I know exactly what happened. Grog's down there, he's got him a woman, he's not really sure if it's a woman or a triceratop, not really sure, kind of looking the same, grabs him some grass and starts numbing on it and goes, looking better. He's just starting to have a little fun, I don't really care which one it is, looking good to me now. I absolutely am convinced that the first use of drugs was accidental abuse. He's just sitting there chewing on this little weed, and all of a sudden the next thing you know, wow, it's a purple moon. Oh, there's 7 of them. Hey, come here, little triceratop, I want to pet you. You know it wasn't the best days, but all of a sudden he's kind of sitting around going, hey man, remember that weed that made us so high and made us date these things? He just broke his leg and he's hurting. I wonder if this would make him feel better. So somewhere along the line we went from abuse to, hey, maybe we could use it for traditional purposes and regular purposes. So they found out that we can take just plants, vegetable material, and start to do things with them. And really that's one of our better sources of drugs today. There are people who the sole excuse they want for you not to destroy the rainforest is we don't know all the drugs that might be in there. If we destroy it before we find that out, we don't know what they're used for. I think that's a dumb excuse, really. I think we should not destroy the rainforest because it's bad to destroy things. But people don't quite get that because we need like rain and oxygen and all that kind of stuff. But some examples of the drugs that we see from the vegetable world. Digitalis. Digitalis is a drug we use to treat congestive heart failure and atrial fibrillations. It comes from the purple foxglove, which looks like this. And you can buy that at Home Depot. Okay, just look for the Digitalis plant. Really nice drug. We have absolutely no idea how it works. We just know what it does. But the actual chemistry inside the body, we still don't know. We've used it forever. It's been one of our older heart drugs. We also know that atropine is called belladonna. You ever heard of belladonna? Belladonna is quite often a drug used for abuse. But if we use it properly, it has a lot of really good properties. We can make atropine out of it, we make scopolamine out of it, we make a lot of different things out of it. We refer to these as belladonna alkaloids. And it's also known as the other name for belladonna, anyone know? Did you go to school anywhere? Belladonna is also known as deadly nightshade. So what do you suppose happens if you take too much of it?
It's deadly.
Yeah, you die. It's just one of those things. But this is deadly nightshade. It's just kind of a nice, pretty flower. And the first thing I would do when I saw this flower is eat it. Yeah, there's some bored people out there. Dextrose, and this is going to be really difficult, so pay attention. Dextrose is just sugar. We get it from sugar. Like sugar cane and sugar beets. You can actually get it from anything. You can make sugar from corn. Hillbillies often do. Morphine comes from the opiate poppy. Now, not all poppies. Just one particular variety of the poppy that grows primarily in Afghanistan, where most of it comes. There's a little bit in different parts of China. But most of our opiates actually come from Afghanistan. The majority of them come from Afghanistan. Harvested legally, you think?
Over there.
Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah, over there. Okay, here, Americans, go kill yourself, you morons. So, all these are just vegetable sources. Are they the only vegetable sources? Absolutely not. We have lots more. When we look at what these things do, Some of these plants, depending on how they work, may become alkaloids. Have I mentioned an alkaloid? Belladonna alkaloids, like atropine. All right, these alkaloids are things that in nature are a little bit alkaline. They tend to be that alkaline process, so we have to combine them with acids. They form water-soluble salts, and that's where we have these atropine sulfates, even morphine sulfate, become alkaloid solutions that make these nice little salts. One of the nice things about an acid and an alkali, if you put them together, what happens? They form a salt. It's pretty simple. Now you take that salt, you put it into a solution,
Salts.
they break back apart. Okay, they dissociate. Remember we talked about electrolyte solutions? Acids and alkalis come together to form a salt. When we take them apart, we end up with something else. So we end up with these alkaloid processes. Glycosides. What are supposed glycosides do?
Like sugars.
Yeah, like glycogen. These things tend to, what's hydrolysis? Hydrolysis.
Break down the water.
Break down by water. So if we put these substances in water, they deal with sugar and then their substance. So we talk about a glycoside, and we could talk about a cardiac glycoside called digitalis. We take digitalis, we take this nice little plant, we mush it up, we find this nice white powder, we put it in a solution of water, it breaks down, we'll find sugar, and we'll find the drug. So if you're really a good chemist, you could actually kind of take that and remove that sugar from the body. All right, the second thing that we probably used, once we found out drugs were really cool, different plants, we started thinking, well, what else can I get? Now keep in mind, if you're a caveman, if you don't have a beaker yet, you can't make anything. You're probably not really good at squeezing an animal until certain juices come out. So really the next thing you can think of is, hey, all those birds, they're licking that rock over there. I wonder what that is. So we look at minerals as a source of drugs. We know these are important things. Birds are really good at it. You find birds somewhere, they're just kind of eating up the dirt. Well, what are they really doing?
Eating minerals.
They're eating minerals. We used to think birds had to eat certain amounts of salt and things, or grains and things to crush up food. Their digestive system's not that silly. They're just getting better minerals. So it's kind of a good thing for them. So we learned that we can get simple iron, iodine, medicinal salts, all from just different forms of stuff that we find laying on the side of the beach, certain types of piles of rocks, all produce these things, and they may or may not have a benefit to the body. Depends on what we need. Now, a lot of these things like iron, how many people need iron supplements?
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah, mostly women. Men do if they have problems with blood formation. But if you don't need it, it's really not a good thing for you to have. All these people who take these vitamins with iron, if you don't need it, why do you need it? It doesn't serve a benefit. Iodine, who needs iodine?
Everybody.
Everybody. Where do you get it?
Salt.
Salt. Iodine mixes very well with sodium chloride. It mixes almost terribly with anything else. So about the best way for us to get iodine in our diet is salt. Several years ago, they started telling everybody, hey, salt's bad for your blood pressure. So what did stupid Americans do?
Stop.
Stop eating salt altogether. Healthy people who didn't have a blood pressure started dying of goiter because there was not salt in their diet. And it's as simple as put it on salt, or put the iodine on the salt, put a little bit of salt on your food. It doesn't take much. But when you're not getting any because you're on a salt-free diet because you listen to ads, it's like all these people with celiac disease, the silly people. If you don't have a problem with gluten, eat gluten. Not everybody has the celiac problem. So all these things are beneficial. It's pretty easy to get. Where do you suppose you get salt?
The ocean.
Yeah, dehydrate the ocean. It's pretty simple. Eventually, as we became more scientific, we started noticing things. We started noticing that there were little chemical things inside bodies that told us what to do. Now, we're talking thousands of years from the first time Grog pulled up a weed and started eating on it to the time that they finally said, ooh, We now found out that if you don't have a good pancreas working, creating little bits of things called insulin, that all of a sudden you can't process sugar and you die very sweet. You know, what do you suppose happened back in Roman times if you had diabetes?
You didn't live long.
Yeah, it's kind of, well, gosh, I don't know what to do about that. We didn't have a way to fix it. Someone found out that, okay, well, it was insulin that helped that stuff get in there, so if we take a pig's liver or pig's pancreas and squeeze it, maybe we'll get some insulin. It's not quite that simple today, but it really is about all we do is we just take these hormones that have been created by animals that we've slaughtered and we start to create it. Almost all insulin sold in the United States is porcine insulin. What's that mean? Comes from pigs.
Isn't it dRNA, I thought?
Isn't it what?
dRNA, or rDNA? Made from the bacteria, replacing the DNA in the bacteria that synthesize the insulin nowadays. I thought that's how they made it.
I don't know what you're saying. Do what now?
It's
Is an rDNA.
like the little r, D,
Right.
DNA. It's how they synthesize it now is they...
They're actually able to synthesize, but that's the next slide.
Oh, okay.
You're talking about this?
I just thought that's how they make insulin now.
Well, they can. Majority of insulin in this country, and the majority sold in this country, is still porcine insulin, which means it comes from pigs, because pigs have a very natural, and actually, if you look at the way pigs behave and look at humans, it's nearly identical. Pigs and humans are very close. Now, what's the problem? Can you think of a cultural issue with giving diabetics pig insulin?
Vegetarians?
Muslims.
Anybody that's really more of the Middle Eastern world, Muslims, Jews, still believe, and a couple other cultures that are well known, they think pigs are dirty, so they don't consume pigs. So they either have to get over that or get their insulin from Canada, because there's very little of it made in this country that's not porcine, which I find very interesting. But that's the way we are in this country. Because keep in mind, who makes this stuff? A manufacturing company trying to make a profit. It's probably not worth their time and effort to make it another way. Not in this country. And we can get all kinds of different hormones. Epinephrine comes this way, insulin, oxytocin. We're now starting to look at synthetic things. Okay, yes, now we can create insulin in a laboratory. It's just not as effective and it's not as stable. It was actually one of the first drugs we were able to create in a laboratory. But we've pretty much given up on trying to do it in high quantities. It's just cheaper to squeeze a pig's pancreas and get it. But a lot of things that are made, a lot of vitamins, almost every vitamin you take, no one took broccoli and squeezed the vitamin A out of it. It's all made in the laboratory. And by the way, it's also almost useless. And you know, most of the vitamin supplements you take don't actually enter your body. There's no way for them to be absorbed in the form that they're delivered to you. I can't remember where I heard it. Somebody was talking about how they own a porta potty company. And you know what porta potties are, right? Okay. They owned this porta potty company, and when the event was over, they had to take these porta potties back to the porta potty heaven, where they would clean them out, and they would just kind of flush them out the backside, and it would just go into this big spill area where it would all kind of be cleaned up and then washed down. And so one of the things that was very common after these big events where they had these things was there would be these little brown pills everywhere. And a lot of times they were so ineffective you could pick them up and look at them and the stamp that said 1 a day was still on them. That's how ineffective most vitamins are. They actually pass out of your body totally undissolved. So my recommendation to you with vitamins is at least get chewables or gummies. Why? Because when they poop them out, you don't even see them. They're probably still minimally effective. Most of those vitamins actually don't absorb the way people think they do. But if they make you feel better about yourself, go for it. A lot of our steroids today, Solumedrol, Solucortef, all the different steroids we use are all created in laboratories because it's easier to get them that way in a pure form than it is to actually squeeze the organ it comes from to make them. because most the corticosteroids are generated or released on the spot rather than stored ready to go. So it just makes it harder to get. A lot of other drugs like lidocaine, amiodarone, these are all chemical drugs. Someone just sat around with a little bit of this, a little bit of this, put it together. We looked at acetaminophen earlier, we're going to see it again in a second. It was all just stuff we created in a laboratory. So a lot of those things were just some chemist sitting there saying, well, I know how to make this chemical. Let's create it in a laboratory, see if it works. Because most good chemists know how to make, they probably know the chemical structure of epinephrine, insulin, and oxytocin, and well, the chemical structure of these is really pretty simple. What's the chemical structure of iron?
Iron.
Fe. It's pretty much, get some Fe, you'll be fine. But they know how to make all this stuff. You can, and I actually knew a college professor that told his students in chemistry how to make cocaine. And they did it. If you tested it, it tested positive for cocaine. If you took it, what happened?
You get high as that?
Nothing. When you make cocaine in a laboratory, and I can't remember which is which, but let's pretend it has a left-hand twist. Active cocaine has a right-hand twist. You can't create it in a laboratory with a right-hand twist. So it's not as easy to just make some of these drugs as you think. Until we figure out how to make it twist the other way, we're kind of stuck. But some drugs we have figured out, and they work just great when we do that. All right, every drug has got multiple names. And we start off with the chemical name. This is the exact chemical makeup of a drug. What is it? If you're that chemist and you say, how do you describe this? What is it? We also have a generic name, and this is the name, we say this is the accepted name suggested by the manufacturer. And accepted is a sort of good word for it, but it's the accepted name we do. The manufacturer usually is going to look at this and kind of say, all right, we want to come up with a name. And it'll often be associated with a trial name or part of the chemical structure, but it's usually something that that first company who makes it says, this is what we want to call it. And then the trade name is how it's marketed. Because nobody wants to take Zika-Bacalufalofalin. So they just call it Zicodin. And the next thing you know, oh, everyone loves this drug. It's great stuff. An official name actually is usually a generic name with the letters USP behind it. It tells you that this is a drug approved in the United States under the United States Pharmacopoeia. It's our official listing of drugs. And how we list a drug and how other countries list a drug could be two different things. There's no such thing as lidocaine in England. It's called xylocaine. Even oxygen in other countries. If you look at an oxygen bottle in this country, what color is it?
Green.
What color is it in other countries? Depends on the country, but most English-speaking other countries, it's black. Why did you? I have no idea. I thought oxygen, well, I don't know why oxygen's green. I guess because it comes from plants. So here's an example of a drug with its names. Chemical name, N-acetylparaminophenol. Next time you have a headache, reach for the N-acetylparaminophenol. Wouldn't you like to have that on the commercial? You have a headache, back pain, have a little bit of fever? We'd like you to take some N-acetylparaminophenol. Then you go to the grocery store and say, hey, pharmacist, I want some N-acetylparaminophenol. Because if you can get that out, you've practiced it quite a bit. You want to have some fun? Have Erickson's in. It's easier for you to say, I'd like some acetaminophen. All right, now remember I said that the generic name is suggested by the manufacturer based off what? Sometimes parts of the chemical name. Can you see it? Acetaminophen. You can actually find it in there. That'd be a great Jeopardy category, wouldn't it? What drug do you see in there? But it's all there. So it's easier for them to say, okay, we're going to call this drug acetaminophen. The trade names of this are very vast. This is kind of a great example because the last one alphabetically is the one that most people know it as. But look at all the other things that we see it in. It's everywhere. A lot of different drugs that you take that aren't even on this drug have got acetaminophen. It isn't just Tylenol. Now the official name, I said the official name is usually generic with USP behind it, and that's what we get. So which of these drugs or names do you think is most common to use?
Generic.
Probably most common is trade. The problem is you go to the grocery store and they're out of Tylenol, and the guy there says, well, you don't need Tylenol, we sell Wallafenol, and it's just as good, why don't you take it? Well, why is it just as good?
It's the same thing.
Same thing.
It's still got the same amount of acetaminophen in it. The problem is, if you learn this, and then all of a sudden, let's just say that you were carrying Tylenol on your ambulance, and someone went out and bought some Wallafenol, and you need to give the Tylenol, and you're like, I don't see any Tylenol. There's no Tylenol in here. Would you know that Wallafenol is just as good? You would if you learned it by the acetaminophen, by the trait, or by the generic name, and you look at it and say, what is it? Oh, the generic is acetaminophen. That's exactly what I'm doing. So by knowing the generic name, you're really in better shape. We should use acetaminophen all the time. I get on medical directors constantly, probably on a monthly basis, when I look over protocols, say, why are you listing trade names? You know, if your doctor writes a prescription for a trade drug, and you go to the pharmacist and say, I want the cheaper generic, can you do that?
Nope.
Yeah.
Not unless the physician said generic equivalent approved. Now, I do have one medical director in this area who wrote in his protocols, generic equivalents approved. Because I got on this, you need to just list it as the generic. Because this downside is he still doesn't let the guys know what the generic is of these drugs. If he listed it by the generic, they'd have to know that in the first place. Do you think you would ever list a drug by its chemical name?
No.
Never? Like oxygen? Do you know what the generic of oxygen is? Oxygen. We talked iron. What do you suppose iron is? Iron. Sodium chloride. Calcium chloride. Sodium bicarbonate. Those are chemical names for drugs. So it isn't common. We're very seldom going to see N-acetylparaminophenol. But you'll probably see other chemical names. Okay, that's not totally unheard of, especially if it's really just a mineral or a common element. Now, generics are really the thing that you need to learn. What do generics mean? Because trades mean very little. If we look at some trade names, here's Monostat. Everyone heard of Monostat?
Yeah.
Monostat is this drug here. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. But Monostat 1, trying to tell you it's just as good as Monostat. It's a trusted name. Same thing, right? If your doctor says, hey, for that, go take some Monostat, you can't find Monostat, but they do have Monostat 1. It's really not even the same drug. It may do similar things, but it may not be what you need. Let's look at these other drugs, Tavist and Tavist Sinus. Really two different, completely separate things. Oh, look, here's some more of this acetaminophen thing. Here's one, Excedrin and Excedrin PM. I think that I have a headache. I don't have any regular Excedrin, but someone has some Excedrin PM. I think I'm going to go ahead and take that while I'm at work as a bus driver. Can you see a downside between one or the other? Yeah, really, other than pain relief, the other two benefits are opposite. One is the stimulant, kind of keeps you up. Actually, caffeine actually is a very good pain reliever. If you really have a headache, don't have anything else, drink a Coke. But the PM has got a diphenhydramine that's real purpose is to do what?
Antihistamine.
An antihistamine. It puts you to sleep. Puts you to sleep really fast. So the generics really tell you more about what the drug is than what the trade name is. Because the trade name is actually, they're there to make you buy something. It's a promotional process. It's there really to help them sell the drug rather than to get you well. So we look at the generic versus trade. Do they do the same things? Well, by generic standards, yeah. They all sell the same thing. Here's our Wallafenin. We have Tylenol, regular Tylenol. We have Walgreens pain reliever. It does have acetaminophen in it. This one's acetaminophen. This is, I think, 500 milligrams. Are they both 500s? Yeah, 500 milligrams, 500 milligrams. These are exactly the same drugs, right? And you know what they did to make it easy on you? They even made the box look like that. Half of the time people go through, oh, I want that red box with the white one. Oh, there it is. I get it home, this isn't Tylenol. Because, you know, we're such good shoppers. So when we look at this, is it the same stuff, same drug? Well, it has the same drug. What you bought, acetaminophen, is the same. There's 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. That's not questioned. What's different is what kind of other stuff are in it. To make, because there's probably this much acetaminophen in a tablet. But to make it more comfortable for you to swallow, you're able to put it in your hand without dropping them through the fingertips and finding little bitty things like this on the floor that the dog licks up. They make them big enough. So what's in that? Well, buffers and fillers and things that really don't do much. But in some minds, maybe it's a little more expensive, but we're going to put a buffer in there that makes it so much easier on your stomach that actually works better. Some of the harsher stuff may not have these buffers. It'll eat your stomach up. You ever heard of a drug like that? Bufferin. What's bufferin? It's buffered aspirin. Aspirin destroys stomachs. So we make bufferin, which is a buffered aspirin, a little bit easier on your stomach. Still got aspirin. Different fillers. Some of them actually contain soaps. Some contain things that you may actually be allergic to. Some people are told, I can only take the generic or the trade name of this because we can't trust the generics. So when your doctor says generic equivalent not approved, there may be a reason for it. The number one reason is he's taking a kit back from the pharmacy or from the drug company to prescribe that drug as written. But we won't get into the ethics behind that. So these things may change absorption things, may buffer to the point it absorbs faster or slower. It may change its movement. We used to have contact cold capsules. We used to be able to take them apart with little bitty balls inside. We got rid of that when people started putting cyanide in pills. But all those little pills dissolved at a different rate, so the contract lasted longer. Really, the drug stayed different. It's just as they dissolved different, it changed things. Well, that was the process of absorption. It found a way to make it absorb different. You could buy the same drug in a different manufacturer, same amount, work differently because it absorbed it differently. Overall, a generic is a generic. They should be equally safe. There shouldn't be a big problem with it. Okay? They should work just fine. When we look at drug classifications, how we classify drugs, well, how do you classify people?
There's a lot of classifications.
Aren't there a lot of different ways? So if I look at someone, okay, let's talk one of my favorite people in the world, Bill Cosby. Love Bill Cosby. One of the best guys in the world, in my opinion. How would you classify Bill Cosby?
Awesome.
Funny. I like funny. This is a funny guy. You know, this other guy, so he's not so funny. So he's a funny guy. You said awesome? I'll go with awesome with Bill Cosby. He's America's dad. I mean, who wouldn't want Bill Cosby for a dad? Well, actually, you listen to some of the stories he tells about his kids, maybe you don't. But I mean, just a really neat guy there. How else?
Male.
Male? He's a male. That differentiates him from the females, right? Yeah? Okay, if you didn't know him, what's the first thing you'd say about him? He's a black guy. Okay, let's not ignore the obvious. Let's not be racially insensitive and call him for what he is. Okay, he's a black guy. He's still an awesome, impressive guy. Who cares what race he is? But that's a fair way to describe him, right? Okay, he's kind of tall. He's educated. So if I look at him and say, here's all the ways of describing someone, there's lots of different ways to say it, but he's still the same guy, right? Well, we really do the same thing with drugs. When we look at a drug, the way it works, how it does things, really just depends on how we want to look at it. So when we look at things, we may classify it by the body system it works on. We have a drug, and for the examples listed here, we're going to use the drug epinephrine, just per rationale. Epinephrine works on the smooth muscles as a relaxant. It just takes your smooth muscles and kind of relaxes them. That's a good thing. It acts specifically on some bronchi because bronchi are really smooth muscles, and if you relax the bronchial smooth muscles, they
Dilate.
dilate. So it's a bronchodilator. I really didn't say anything different. Epinephrine is a bronchodilator. It's a smooth muscle relaxant. Okay, no big deal. They just are. The class of action is a sympathomimetic. Tomorrow you'll know what the hell I just said.
It mimics the sympathetic system.
Well, it mimics our sympathetic system. The sympathetic system controls the bronchi and the smooth muscles. Wow, imagine that. So it could be a sympathomimetic. So if someone comes up to you and says, epinephrine's a sympathomimetic, no, it's not, it's a bronchodilator. Bill Cosby's not black, he's an African American. Okay, it's the same thing. That's all how we look at it. Mechanism of action, well, it's a beta adrenergic agonist. Again, tomorrow you'll know what that means. Some of you may remember this from EMT school, most of you just forgot it. You know a beta adrenergic agonist you learned in EMT school? See, it tells you forgot about it. How many drugs did you learn in EMT school?
6.
Okay, start narrowing them down.
Oxygen.
Albuterol, very good.
Oxygen.
That was everyone should have said a drug, and somebody would have been right. No one ever wants to be right. A beta adrenergic agonist means that it works through beta receptor sites, adrenergic, adrenal glands, sympathetic system. An agonist is in favor of. An antagonist works in opposition to. So it works to promote the sympathetic system through beta receptors. Again, you'll know more about that tomorrow, as we say. Really, I didn't do anything different in the naming of these drugs. They all work the exact same way. It was just a different way that I put it. I could lump all kinds of drugs under, well, which drugs would be smooth muscle relaxants? Which drugs might be bronchodilators? Which drugs might be sympathomimetics? Which drugs might be beta adrenergic agonists? There's a possibility I'm going to have them clustered. We have drugs that are really good beta adrenergic agonists, but they really aren't bronchodilators because they're actually stronger in other parts of the body. We have a lot of drugs that are bronchodilators that aren't beta adrenergic agonists at all because they enter the door through a different mechanism. Right, so not all these are always the same. Epinephrine, that's just examples of how we might classify it. So really we classify by body system, the class of the agent, and how it actually works, the mechanism. And again, they may be different. It could be that it only does one thing. Drugs also come in multiple forms. The drug forms that you will look at are all listed in your book as far as pills, powders, tablets, suppositories, capsules, and how you take these might be different. Do you really want to take a suppository completely different than a tablet? Okay, you need to go look those up and find out why I think that's kind of important. It'll taste buttery. little chocolatey because it's got cocoa butter in it, but it's not the best way to take that drug. It leaves an aftertaste. Liquids, we have lots of different ways that we put a liquid together. All of these are listed in your book. Go look them up. Testable material. I guarantee there'll be at least one of these and one of those on the next exam. So go make sure you look those up.
Wouldn't the capsules and tablets be the same thing on the solid?
Go look that up. Because they're not. There's a reason they're different. Okay. Any questions so far? No? Keep in mind, this is all, well, it's going to take a lot of study, and you have between now and next Monday to learn it. But you only have 2 lectures worth of stuff to do. You just got to put forth a little bit of time, break it down in small groups, and you'll get it. If there's no questions, give them 10. And legislation, where drugs kind of came from, and actually we're going to start with, this should be drug legislation and development, because we kind of do it in the opposite order. But years ago, drugs had really no oversight. You could get somebody who came along and said, drink this tonic, it's, snake medicine, snake water, it'll cure everything. They used to have people go around with wagons and try to sell you all this stuff to make you better. we finally realized that this was a problem. And in modern times, 1906, which really isn't that long ago, back when I was in grad school, it was only 80 years earlier. For you, it's a lot longer than that now. But in 1906, we really had the first real piece of drug legislation. This was called the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act. So it didn't just deal with drugs, it also dealt with foods. Now, there were a lot of foods being sold out there that weren't really safe and weren't done well. We know this is the Food and Drug Act only because we like to shorten everything in America. We love to abbreviate. This helped us establish what we now know as the FDA. It wasn't called the FDA then, but it morphed from this over time. The whole purpose of this was to prevent the manufacture and trafficking of mislabeled, poisonous, and harmful foods and drugs. So if you put on there that this particular stuff was going to cure rheumatoid arthritis, or at the time they just called it rheumatism, it probably should do that. Okay? We're supposed to tell people that it did it. We also had to tell them if it contains 50% arsenic. A lot of drugs contain dangerous things, just in small amounts. Keep in mind, small amounts is drug, large amounts is a toxin. Okay? With every drug, right? Every drug known to man can be a toxic level. So it just told people that if we have something dangerous, we have to kind of tell you about it. We have to let you know what some of the side effects are. We have to let you know what's going on. This also established the United States Pharmacopoeia as our official standard. So when you decided, I'm going to take my digitalis flour and I'm going to grind it up and I'm going to give you 2 tablespoons, that's enough. Well, someone else said, well, 6 is better. So it set a standard for how much a drug really was and what a drug should be. Now, there's a weakness. Anytime you see the word federal, what's that mean?
Government.
It means government. How come the FBI doesn't get involved in murders unless you watch Bones, but always gets involved in kidnapping?
Because it's not a federal offense.
Cross state lines.
State lines. All kidnappings, the first assumption is it crosses a state line. What's the first thing I'm going to do when I take somebody? Yeah, I'm going to go to my house where they know I'm at. Yeah, there's an assumption that you're going to take someone across a state line. Murder occurred within a state. Keep in mind, the federal government, under our Constitution, says the federal government shall pass no laws that control the states. There's a rule that says that. So this only applied when?
And they cross state lines.
When I made a drug in Texas and I sold it in Louisiana. I can do anything I want in Texas as long as I stay here. So we found some weaknesses. It was kind of a good law, but it really didn't do very well. It required that, or it made sure that drugs didn't have any adulterants, didn't have anything dangerous in it, said nothing about its safety and effectiveness, but again, it didn't apply across interstate, or in-state, only across interstate stuff. So that became kind of a problem. And we started looking at, okay, how are we going to solve some of these different problems? And I get a kick out of some of these different things. You recognize any of these things? This is a label off an old bottle. I like the fact this is 1 gallon. How many of you buy drugs by the gallon? Here's a gallon of Imodium. That should last you a night. This was a handwritten bottle of atropine sulfate. Doctors would just write on what drug they had. I can't read that. I used to know what that said. Some kind of an acid. So in 1906, we tried to do it. We realized there were some problems. By 1914, we realized that, one of the big problems we're having right now is a lot of opiate issues. There used to be opium dens. Just like you could go into a bar and buy alcohol, you could go into an opium den and buy opiates. And that meant that you had all kinds of people with bigger problems, because even though some people have issues with alcohol, pretty much we know that heroin is automatically addictive from your first dose, right? So it created some big issues. So we started looking at some of this stuff and we said, all right, well, what are we going to do to fix these? Well, the Harrison Narcotic Act came out in 1914 and said, we're going to stop the addiction and dependence on some of these things by making heroin and cocaine illegal. You cannot sell them in your opium dens. So you really had no way to sell them legally. Remember, we've never stopped the illegal trade, right? We're just never going to do it. Arlington tried at one point during the Super Bowl. They tried to stop prostitution. Did you see how they did that? Arlington, smartest city in the world. They had a prostitution exclusion zone around the Super Bowl. I thought Texas was an exclusion zone. Am I wrong on this? Is there a place you can go? Is a chicken ranch still operating somewhere? So, and we made it so it was illegal to do this legally. It helped us establish rules on how we import, manufacture, and sell opium and coca derivatives. We're not saying you can't import it. You're saying you have to import it properly for medical purposes. And we had to do it for the intent of being used as a medicine, not just as a getting high drug. And that's what I find humans are very weak. How many animals do you think are out there trying to find a high?
Cats.
Well, cats don't really count as animals. They're alien creatures. Yeah, there aren't a lot of animals that just sit there and go, man, I really could use a beer right now. Most animals are perfectly happy with their lives. Humans couldn't do that to save their lives. We did establish illegal drugs. Heroin, specifically, is an illegal drug. And I got a kick out of this picture. This is an old bottle of heroin. You notice who makes it?
Bear.
Bear.
Didn't they used to give it for cocaine addiction?
They gave it for everything. It was one of the first drugs used for painkillers. The problem was once you took it, you kind of felt like you needed it more and more.
It's not a bad marketing ploy.
Yeah, it's a great thing. Take it and it'll last, well, forever. You'll rob your neighbors over this one. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is one that really had some of the biggest effects. This one replaced that Pure Food Act. All the issues and flaws we had in 1906 got replaced essentially 22 years later, or 32 years later actually, and looked at drugs kind of in a different light. They started listing the habit-forming properties and side effects of drugs. So you take this aspirin and you start having this ringing in your ears, well, it had to tell you that. Because we should know, but we're actually starting to learn drug chemistry. It required that dangerous drugs be issued by a prescription. How did you get your cocaine and your heroin prior to this, when it was legal?
Down to the drugstore.
You went down to the drugstore. You didn't need a prescription. The druggist might look at it and say, well, you've had 3 of those this week, I'm not giving you another. But other than that, they can sell you anything you wanted. You went to the local apothecary and he mixed up the drugs and said, here you go. Not much different than witch doctors. Then we started looking and saying, no, some of these drugs are too dangerous. You need a physician to tell you how to take this and how much of it you're going to do. So we established the process of prescriptions. We had this Durham-Humphrey Amendment in 1952 that made sure that pharmacists did something different with what we called the legend drugs. Okay, those specifically needed certain types of prescriptions. We see those a little different today. We still use the same term. We're going to talk about what those are in a second. The newest one that really has had a major effect is the Federal Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. We call this the Controlled Substance Act. This is actually its big long name. And what do you suppose its purpose was?
To prevent drug abuse.
Drug abuse. We have all these people who are abusing drugs because Americans, humans in general, are weak and we need something to get our mind off of stuff. So we looked at how we put out drugs and looked to see what's their potential for abuse. What's the potential for abusing aspirin? Man, I miss that chalky taste. I gotta get me some aspirin. Just not a lot, right? If my blood's a little thick, I just have to take more aspirin. I have thin blood. So we looked at that potential for abuse and said, all right, what is it really? And we came up with 5 schedules. I like using the word me because I was so highly involved in it. There were 5 categories that they put things in, looking at the medicinal use and the potential for abuse and marrying those two and deciding where they were. So we looked at these and we said, all right, Schedule 1 drugs have no medical use and high abuse for potential. Or high potential for abuse. Those are drugs that really are out there only for one purpose. Give people out. Nothing medical about it. And we look at this and say, no accepted medical use. people, I keep trying to push that one, and we'll show you that in a minute. These are the legend drugs, or I'm sorry, these ones here will become the legend drugs because these are acceptable medical use with a high abuse potential. So you can't get these till the doctor says, okay, here you go in just a little. Okay, so these have had to be really more carefully regulated by the pharmacists. They really couldn't just give them out, and the physician couldn't just give you here's a year's supply of morphine. A little bit, small amounts for safety and efficacy, because there's a high abuse for abuse potential, but we still have a good benefit from it. Schedule 3 has an accepted medical use, but only a moderate abuse potential, and even if you do abuse it, it's probably not going to be too devastating. Schedule 4 has an accepted medical use and a low abuse potential, maybe a limited dependence. Very few people would take this point and really have to keep using it. And then Schedule 5 are those really low abuse potentials, low dependence. Yeah, you kind of have to look at some of these and say, wow, I have to be pretty hard up really even to think that's a good abusive drug. So when we look at what drugs fall into this category, Schedule 1, no accepted medical use and a high abuse potential. Heroin, marijuana, LSD, peyote, mescaline. Those have no accepted medical use. Even marijuana. So why is marijuana now legal? First of all, is marijuana legal?
No, on a federal level.
On a federal level, marijuana has never been made legal. In Colorado, California, Washington, it's not legal. It has been decriminalized. In other words, they're not charging you with it. I find it interesting in Colorado because there's, 5 national parks in Colorado?
You can't do it.
So somebody decides to drive into the national park and literally get a Rocky Mountain high at Rocky Mountain National Park, and what happens?
They get arrested.
They get arrested by Ranger Rick and Boo Boo because they're not in Colorado anymore.
On federal property.
That's just the way it works. Now, is there an actual medical use for marijuana?
You could
They
argue.
say there's doctors that say.
No, there's not. There's an accepted medical use for TLC. Or THC. TLC. That's probably got a medical use for THC. You can get the same pain relief and effects by taking a pill, but what does it not do?
Doesn't get you high.
Make you high and hungry and just sit around doing nothing. Nothing. People don't want that as an option. They want a good excuse to get high while they're clearing glaucoma. You get the same thing taking a pill, you just don't get the other effects. That's really the ideal pill, right? Because it doesn't have the side effects. They kind of miss that point. So when you get right down to it, marijuana still doesn't really fit as it has an accepted medical use. The chemical in it can be derived and give you that benefit. Marijuana itself really isn't. Okay, and that's kind of a big issue. You know the one product that they do sell at all those different stores in Colorado and California that is not selling well? THC pills. For the people who want to go in just for the medical benefit, they have the pills. You can get the medical benefit, but not the high. They can't sell them. They have to sell them. They can't sell them. The Schedule 2 drugs are all of our opiate derivatives that don't come into the heroin. So this is morphine. This is Dilaudid. It's the codeines, the methadones, the amphetamines, those uppers that stimulate you. And the amphetamines that fit into this category are usually what? What kind of drugs or what kind of conditions would we treat with these amphetamines and methamphetamines?
Like ketamine?
ADD. When you have attention deficit disorder, the easiest way to fix it is give you a little bit of a stimulant and you just kind of calm down. But it's one of those things, every month you have to go to your doctor, get a script, take it in. You can't just have it phoned in. It's a little more complicated than the stuff you would do to get some of these drugs. The Schedule 3 has limited amounts of opium. The Schedule 3 drugs would include, it used to be you could buy Tylenol 3 with codeine. Now more people, instead of buying that, buy Vicodin, okay, hydrocodone. It's kind of the same thing.
Hydrocodone went up.
Hydrocodone is being, did it actually go up or they talked about going up?
No, it went up.
Did
It's
it?
Schedule 2.
Why?
Because people were abusing.
Massively abused. They'd go to the doctor, I'm having some back pain, really bad back pain. A scale of 1 to 10, it's a 12. And they run out of the office when they get their skip kicking because they got their drugs. So I knew it was going to go up. So put hydrocodone up here now. But other small amounts of codeine, small amounts of morphine. Legal to sell in small amounts, usually mixed with something else. And as mentioned, the Tylenol with. So just a touch to kind of take the edge off. Schedule 4 drugs. These would have barbitals, chlorohydrate, phenobarbital, diazepam. Everyone gets upset with diazepam. What do you know diazepam as in most cases? Valium. Well, it's such a hard thing. We need a script for Valium, we need a script for morphine. Well, yeah, you need a script for scheduled drugs, but it isn't as bad to replace it. And Valium, you can almost take your own weight in Valium before you overdose on it. You'll get a really good high and be really mellow, but really not a bad thing. Schedule 5 drugs, these are real interesting, and I get a kick out of people who just sit there and say, man, I got to rob the pharmacy, I got to get some of this. Well, just go to your pharmacist, because this is going to be behind the counter. You can't find this there on the regular aisle. And go, oh, really cough, really bad. That's the stuff back there with the touch codeine. And the pharmacists get tired of you spreading diseases and give you some just little cough syrup with a little bit of codeine in it. There's anti-diarrheals that also have codeine in it. Just go in there really quick, just kind of like, hurry, hurry, hurry. I need something really, really strong. Please, 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 hurry. I'm on my way to the bathroom right now. Give it to me. And they just hand you some parapectin. And then again, you can run out of the store because you got your drugs. Not a lot of abuse potential, because if you take an awful lot of anti-diarrheals just to get your codeine,
You shouldn't.
you're going to be one sore-butted guy after a while, because there's going to be a brick up there that'll never come out. When we look at how drugs are made, drugs go through a really long process. And this is the thing, everyone looks at things and says, can't we get an Ebola vaccine really quick? Sure. We probably have Ebola vaccines out there now. What are we unsure of?
What it does.
What else it does? And what does it do? We may know that it stops Ebola in laboratory mice. Well, so do hammers. The end result may be exactly the same, right? Mice don't live long enough for this drug to have bad side effects. So we need to know what it does. So when we look at what happens, there's this really long timeline of how we put a drug into market. And it would be really best, this is where I need a slide projector that has a fold out, because it really goes a lot farther than this. But we start off with our preclinical testing, the research and development. This is some chemist sitting in his office going, if I put this blue beaker in with this yellow beaker, what happens? And it's probably more than just getting a foamy, smoky green beaker. But they'll test stuff in this area for about 1 to 3 years, average being 18 months, and try to see what all happens in the beaker. When they measure the pH, is this a drug that we're expecting to be a pill, but when you put it in water it has a pH of 1? That's bad. If you give it as an injection, it makes all the things melt, because they'll just test it in tissue. Let's push this on some brain cells. Ooh, we're not going to do that. So they test it quite a bit. They also look to see if they can recreate the process. Can we make it over and over and over again consistently? Eventually they'll test it on a few animals. A few slow-moving secretaries, mostly rabbits and mice. But they'll do that for a really short-term process. And somewhere in here, there'll be a 30-day safety review. They get to the point where they think, okay, this drug's had something, let's take it to, who does that, do you think, the safety review?
FDA.
Yeah, the little blue lines, FDA looks at it. This is all industry doing stuff, the blue lines is the FDA. So you say, we've got this drug, we think it's going to do this. That's made all the mice taller, they've all been good dancers, 2 of them can do the tango, we want to market it. There's a 30-day review they go through to say, okay, so far what you've got looks good, we don't see any problems, go ahead and start. So they'll continue the animal studies, and they'll probably start doing a few more animal studies, using bigger animals, like maybe instead of mice and rats, they'll use rabbits and guinea pigs, and maybe even chimpanzees and monkeys. Closer to getting into humans. They may actually start some initial human trials with just a few people. And quite often they try this on perfectly healthy people just to see if the drug is going to have an effect on them and see what happens. You can volunteer to be tested with drugs. Not enough. But some of these things, you take this drug, what happened to you? Well, my hair fell out and I don't know why I all of a sudden have breasts. I wouldn't be upset with that, but I have 6 of them. That's a worry. So this is usually a small thing. But if the outcomes are good, then they'll take a larger group of people and try to, and maybe some people that are having the problem they're trying to correct. But they usually do those in double-blind studies, so you come in and say, I've got this disease, I'd like to be a part of the study, that's okay. Here's this little white powder, take that, come back in 6 months and tell me what happened. So you may not get the drug. So if you're looking for that life-saving, last-ditch effort to get this thing, there's a 1 in 3 chance you're not getting the drug. Because you're probably going to get 1/3 nothing, 1/3 a drug we already know does it for comparison, and then the drug. So if you're looking for the life-saving thing, it may not actually be, which is that gamble. If that doesn't work, then we go in, or if that works out okay, then we use a little bit larger group, and that little bit larger group really needs to be pretty good sized. And when you think pretty good sized, what are you thinking? Thousands, tens of thousands. And you do that in multi-market studies. You put a drug out and you test it with some research labs in Los Angeles, in Dallas, in Omaha, in Minneapolis, in Washington, in Boston, New York, Miami. Because we don't want to know that one works really great in a nice, sunny, warm environment, but can't work at all in Boston where it's rainy and snowy and people worship those Brady guys. It may work totally different if you're a Patriots fan. Who knows? But if you add cheese, that's great in Wisconsin. So we need to test it out in large markets and see what happens. Again, most of these are double-blind studies. You may not actually be getting the drug because we want to see what's going on. Somewhere at the end of that, you're going to have to resubmit into the FDA. Now keep in mind, this part here, we had 1 to 3 years here. This process of testing is 2 to 10 years to bring this drug out. So we may now be 13 years into the drug when we get to the initial National Drug Administration review. This is the FDA part of it. They're looking at what the drug does. And this can take 24 months to 7 years to go through this process where they look at it, give you some advice, maybe you do a little bit of tweaking to the drug, redo some studies, come back and look at it. So we're 20 years into it by the time we get to here. And the FDA says, all right, you can now put that drug out. Now, keep in mind, this is only in America, right? A lot of these drug companies aren't American drug companies. They still have to prove they're going to sell in the United States if they've been through all this. So all those German manufacturers of drugs, Japanese manufacturers of drugs, still have to come to the USA and do all this. They have to prove their worth. That's why a lot of people, when they can't get the relief they need by going to an American pharmacy, do what?
They travel.
Mexico, Europe. Europe's FDA process is about 5 years, not 20. Other countries, it's really not regulated much at all. You can do trial stuff, and of course, if I'm a drug company and I'm looking at, how am I going to get a whole bunch of people to do this? Africa. Very little regulation in Africa. And you know something else that happened most of the time when we did these things for years? You know who we tested these on? Males. Adult males. Adult white males. The FDA has finally come out and said, you know what, that's all wonderful. What's it do to non-whites? What's it do to women? What's it do to children? And here's an interesting one. What's it do to pregnant women? Now, you're a pregnant woman. You can see yourself there, right? I've got this brand new baby. Most pregnant women aren't sitting around going, I don't know if I want this thing. Most of them want the baby, right? So they're sitting around going, I want to test a drug. Let me test a drug. How are you going to do that? I said, well, that's a very nice octopus we just gave birth to. You don't want a drug that's going to change the structure of your baby. But a lot of drugs do. You ever heard of a drug called thalidomide? What did you hear about thalidomide?
It was back in the 50s, and they gave it out, and it started causing congenital birth defects.
Major birth defects.
Like
It was going to be this drug was going to cure morning sickness because apparently soda crackers didn't work well enough. So they were giving phthalimide out to all these pregnant women without a lot of good research, and they gave birth to seals. Literally. Because the kids were born with little bitty short radius and ulna, little bitty short ulnas and femurs, and very long fingers and metatarsals. I mean, they literally looked like seals. Okay, they were born with flippers. It changed how birth development, how the cell development worked. So when we look at these phases, to really know the safety and efficacy of a drug, we need to know what it does to children, to pregnant women, to women opposed to just men. We need to know, is there a genetic difference in ethnicity and racial problems because of these drugs? Because some of them have those problems. Most of the time we study on them adult white males. Well, it worked on them. You know, here, black female pregnant lady, you take it, let's see what happens. We need to really know about the drugs before we start doing that. Most drugs, you read the drug inserts even today. Safety not tested on children. Safety not tested on pregnant women. Use with caution. Doesn't say don't use. It says we don't even have enough information to tell you not to do it. How do we learn that? Well, here, kid, have this pill. Ooh, he blew up. After 10 or 12 of those, then they kind of get, well, maybe we shouldn't use it in children. But it's a trial and error process. You know, the sad part is today that actually occurs from this point on. FDA is now trying to say we need to do it during this process. When we get to 7 years, do we really still have a safe drug? Actually, no. One of the things we've learned is we still don't have a safe drug. You know, a good indication of that? Any of you sit at home during the day on Monday through Friday and watch TV because you don't have a job or you're studying, you go to class at night or you're sick or whatever? Every third commercial is about what?
Drug
If
lawsuit.
you've taken this drug and developed this symptom, call this lawsuit or law company. These are drugs that were perfectly acceptable on the market that later in our advanced reaction or our adverse reaction reporting, that over time it started to develop spots on livers, you started developing cancer, you started having vegetative growths on hearts, you started to develop breasts on men. All these things started to develop. Well, those are long-term problems that we need to know about. And a lot of those were perfectly good drugs. When Vioxx hit the market, it was going to fix all the problems we had. Now it's going to kill you. So a lot of different things that are out there that we still have to market long-term afterwards, and it may be years before we know the downside. Remember when Governor Perry came out and said, hey, this new drug called Gardasil, great stuff. We want every person under 14 that's a female to get this to ward off HPV. Remember that? I was not really happy with the fact that I had a governor who's not a doctor telling me that I have to give my daughter, who at the time was 13, this thing to ward off a potentially sexually transmitted disease. Why was I so upset about that?
Doesn't it cause like a severe reaction in some?
Well, the thing is, we don't know what happens out here. I want to know what happens out here first. Before you tell me everyone has to get it, I want to know what happens. I want 10, 20 years of safety with the drug before I start giving it to my child. Because I'm weird like that. And I have an easier way to tell my daughter we're going to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. Okay? And it's a pretty effective way. You know, I tell her men are really evil, and she believed me, and that's a good thing. So we look at the timeline for drugs. You know, why do we not just rush to put a drug on the market? Well, we have a lot of testing that goes on. And also keep in mind that all this testing, and here's another interesting part, is for the one thing we think the drug can do. Remember what we learned about Tylenol?
Multiple functions.
It's got at least two. It kills pain, or at least relieves it a little bit, and fever. Which one do you think it's approved for?
Pain.
Both.
Yeah. Other uses for it are considered off-label. It's not what the FDA intended the study to be for, but we've learned to use it for that. We have a lot of drugs in medicine that fit that category. An awful lot of them. Now, some of them have gone through this process for multiple things. It's quicker when we already know the safety of the drug, but the FDA finally approves it. Y'all familiar with a drug called Benadryl? Years ago, everyone was all excited because to get Benadryl in the past, you had to go to your doctor. Doctor had to write your prescription. People are so excited. Benadryl is now available over the counter. Big media ads on TV. Benadryl is now available over the counter. It always was. You had to buy it as something else. What is Benadryl? What's the generic of Benadryl?
Diphenhydramine?
Diphenhydramine. You could buy it very easily in a drug called Sominex. A Sleepies. It was actually a NyQuil. What did all those drugs do? Made you sleep. What's one of the side effects of Benadryl? Makes you drowsy. Hey, you know what? Someone figured that out. So they took half a dose of diphenhydramine, put it in a bottle, renamed it, sold it over the counter as something else. All you'd have to do if you had allergies was take 2 of them. No one figured that out. Well, a few of us did. We just kept quiet about it. People always wonder, why do you have those drugs? I didn't have a problem sleeping, but if I had allergies, I gave them to people. Actually, I didn't have allergies. I gave them to other people who had allergies who were irritating me. That way they'd go to sleep and quit irritating. All right. Who remembers what pharmacokinetics was? Don't look here. What's the easier way to put it? Movement. Kinetics. Movement. So we're going to look at how drugs go into the body, how they get absorbed, how they get biotransformed, which is how they get metabolized, how we move them through the body, and then how we get rid of them. We have to get rid of all of them. So let's start off with absorption, because it's important to get a drug in. Absorption is defined as how we get a drug into the bloodstream and then transported to the site of action. Nearly all drugs have to get into the bloodstream to go to their site of action. And let's use as an example something called nitroglycerin paste. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes.
Take a little bit of nitroglycerin paste, you put it on a little piece of paper, and you just stick it right here. And it goes directly to your heart to ease the pain of angina, right? Just absorbs straight into the heart? No. Everyone thinks it does, but you know what? If you took that same patch and put it right here, it would do the exact same thing. You can put it on the soles of the foot. It's going to do the exact same thing. You can actually put it underneath the door handle of your partner's or your other ambulances, so that when they reach to open the door handle, they get the nitroglycerin absorbed through their fingers, and they'll get a major headache and maybe even get dizzy and pass out. Not that I recommend you doing that. So why do we put it here?
Shorter distances.
It's not a shorter distance, because what's it have to do?
Get to the blood.
It has to get into the capillaries, into the venules, into the veins, into the major vessels, and then go to the heart, and then actually go through the entire circulatory system until enough of it actually gets into the heart itself to do anything into the heart. So it really has nothing to do with where you put it. It still has to get into the circulatory system to work. So with the exception of things like eye drops that work right there, or this cream I'm going to put right here on my whatever problem I need cream for, little bit's a localized thing. For the most part, it has to get in the circulatory system to actually do its job. So put it here is a psychological advantage. You put it on here, the chest pain goes away, then, oh, thank God. The next time you have a little lady irritating you and say, well, I need some nitroglycerin paste, just put it on the butt until that's where you think her heart is. But don't tell your supervisor I said to do that, because you will get in trouble for it. But it'll work just fine. So it's all a matter of how we get it to the site of action. We'll put this in 2 different definitions. One is what we call enteric absorption. Enteric absorption is how we get it into the gastrointestinal system. The combining term for intestines is entero. So enteric, entero. This is putting it into the digestive system. Now it's really more than just it goes into the GI tract. It isn't, if it hits the mouth or hits the butt or anywhere in between, it's enteric. Because what it really has to do is it has to be absorbed through the portal system. And the front part of the mouth, not the back part, but the front part, if you put a drug kind of right in here, or you put a drug really shallow into the rectum, it actually avoids the portal circulation. It'll go directly into the vena cava and right back to the heart. You put it a little deeper, now it goes through the normal iliac veins, into the portal circulation, to the liver, gets filtered, and then goes to the heart. So it's not as simple as through the mouth or through the butt, but essentially the gastrointestinal system and the portal circulation have to be involved. Parenteric means around the gut. We're not using it at all. So it avoids that portal circulation. There are all kinds of misclassifications of this, misunderstanding of this. A lot of people say this is oral, this is injected. Well, not all parenteric has to be injected, and not all enteric has to be oral. It's just a matter of how we get it in there, how we get the system. And actually, your book has contraindications of which one's which, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Once that drug gets into our system, and it gets into the circulatory system, finds its way to cells that it might want to work on, we know that we now have to find a way to get this drug into a cell. Because remember our whole goal, for a drug to work, it takes a cell and it either turns it up or down or on or off. All it does is alters the normal function of a cell under normal physiologic properties, right? So somehow we got to get a drug into a cell. And we do that through either trying to go through pores and channels, like we have a little pore right here that we go through. We might have a transport system, like it combines with some other chemical and then moves through. Or occasionally it just directly penetrates right through this phospholipid bilayer into the cell. Okay, it's going to do one of those three things. The pores and channels are usually small things. Very few drugs can move through these. They are very specific to very specific compounds. And we're going to talk tomorrow about sodium channels, calcium channels, potassium channels. And when we talk about those channels, we're talking about things like this. They're groups of proteins. And remember, this cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer studded with proteins. The proteins can be either reactor sites, receptor sites, or maybe even groups that form channels. So as it hits these little proteins, a sodium channel is receptive to sodium. A potassium channel is receptive to potassium. It opens up and lets those substances go through. So very specific to what they're designed for. The transport systems are things that move a drug across a cell membrane. And usually what they'll end up doing is they'll combine with one thing, they'll go to those receptor sites, and they'll make them kick in and make something work. And usually what happens is that cell then kind of works its way through the process, and in a lot of ways this is really more useful getting it out than getting it in. We look at this as the P-glycoprotein process as an example. This is the one that takes drugs out. We have similar ones that might take one in. You can think of insulin as one that helps get stuff in. But we use this P-glycoprotein thing to get drugs out of the kidneys and the liver and the placenta and the intestines and the brain. It just helps us take this drug that was now on the inside and push it back to the outside. The direct penetration is probably the most common. And you look at simple drugs like oxygen. Oxygen doesn't need a port or receptor. How's oxygen get into a cell? Yeah, little oxygen here, lots of oxygen here, simple diffusion pushes it in. Works great. Most drugs actually probably work that way as long as they are lipid soluble. Why would they have to be lipid soluble?
Phospholipid
The
bilayer.
phospholipid bilayer, it has to just kind of blend in with it. It just morphs like it's the wall and gets through and goes to the other side. So as long as it can kind of pass through, it's kind of like, you can't see me because I'm also lipid. It just goes right through. If it's not lipid soluble, it can't go in. Because it knows you don't belong. We also know that drugs move based on some other properties, one of which is the polarity of a molecule. Now we talked about ions. An ion is a molecule that either gains or loses an electron, has a negative charge or a positive charge. Well, these actually have no net charge in their design. And what would this be?
Water.
Yeah, water, H2O. Okay, what was it? Dihydrogen. monooxidate or something like that. There's all kinds of fancy ways to say it. But two hydrogens and an oxygen, when you put these together, it tends to be more positive on this side, more negative on this side. So it's got a really no true charge, but it tends to have an uneven distribution. So it's not ionized as being positive or negative, it's polar, meaning we can find one side more positive and one side more negative. Okay, kind of like the Earth, got a North Pole and South Pole. We got a positive pole, we got a negative pole. When we look at these things, they tend to like to move in different ways. And our rule is like dissolves like. If you have a polar molecule, it tends to dissolve in polar solvents. Why is water a polar solvent?
Because it's polar.
Because it's polar. It's really our example of a polar substance. But if we had another molecule that tended to form that way, where it was more positive on one, more negative on the other, it would tend to dissolve well in water. Now, sugar dissolves well in water. It's great for that, but it won't cross lipid membranes. Why? How much fat do you think there is in sugar? Yeah, not a lot. So it's not very lipid soluble. It'll dissolve in water, just doesn't go very anywhere. We need something to help carry it in there, like, oh, I don't know, insulin. All right, ions do have a role. When we have things that are ionized, they usually don't cross cell membranes very well. Once it's ionized, it doesn't tend to cross it. Unionized, it does great. Ionized, it doesn't. We see a drug, an example here is a quaternary ammonium compounds. These things have lots of nitrogen in them, because that's where ammonia comes from. And they are always positively charged. So if they're positively charged, they would be a... I'm sorry, yeah, that was 2 tests ago. Yeah, positively charged cations, right? These things don't cross most of the cell membranes of the body. Well, this is really something nice and easy for us to use. Knowing that is a good thing. Now, I'm not sure they knew this, but they found out it worked. We use this in a drug called tubercularine. You ever heard of that? You ever heard of curare?
Yes.
We still use curare. We have better drugs now. We use like succinylcholine, vecuronium. But curare was the drug that they would take needles. These are called poison dart frogs. Not because they like to shoot out like darts, but because the natives in South America would find a way to take little bitty darts, rub them across the backs of the poison dart frogs, get the poison on them, put them in a blowgun, shoot it at their prey. The prey would get paralyzed when its diaphragm froze. They didn't kill them, it just suffocated them to death by their muscles not moving. Prey would fall to the ground, they'd go home and eat the thing. Well, how come you can eat stuff that's been poisoned? Wouldn't you poison yourself? I mean, if you fed this thing cyanide, you wouldn't want to eat the thing because it'd be full of cyanide, right? Well, the nice thing about this particular drug being a quaternary ammonium compound and not crossing most membranes, it'll go ahead and paralyze the thing and eat it, but when you eat it, remember this probably got into the vasculature right away because it was injected, right? Now you eat it, you're not putting it in your bloodstream, you're putting it in your stomach. Guess what it won't do? Cross the stomach membranes. So it's totally great injected, does nothing if you swallow it. You want to test that? We got some succinylcholine down the hall. We'll have some of you ingest it and some of you inject it. We'll see who has the problems. Okay, see, this is why they don't let me do these lab experiments in class anymore. Notice I said anymore. So with these ionized things, ionized substances usually don't cross cell membranes. And that's a good thing. We know that there are some things that are called pH-dependent ions. And that means that the pH actually changes whether or not they're ionized or not. You've seen an example of this. Let me see if I explain it, if you can see it. But we have this thing that when you put it in a different pH, say the pH becomes more acidic, it tends to release more drug as opposed to having it bind. We know that acids tend to ionize basic medium. Basic substances, alkaline solutions, tend to ionize acid medium, so they work kind of opposite. We know this works with aspirin. Aspirin is, what's its other name?
Acetylsalicylic acid.
Acetylsalicylic acid. Aspirin doesn't work very well in the stomach. Why not? It's very acidic, but we put it into the duodenum, it tends to work a little bit better, absorbs relatively well. Okay? Because in the intestines, it kind of becomes ionized, really can't absorb as well there. In the stomach, actually I think in the stomach it becomes non-ionized, tends to cross there, won't do it in the intestines. So again, because of the pHs, the acids tend to ionize in basic medium, where again the basic medium basic medium, meaning it will ionize, means it won't cross. The stomach again being very acidic, it should not ionize, so it's a useful drug. So that's kind of a nice thing. It becomes ionized in an alkaline solution like the intestines, it won't cross anymore. We use that to produce something called ion trapping. Now first of all, let me go back to this. I mentioned that you've already been told something about a pH change thing. Remember what that was?
Buffer.
For drug movement. pH change for buffers, that would happen. But which one causes drug movement? Not more than 2, maybe 3 layers. Oxygen. Remember, oxygen binds with hemoglobin? What makes it leave the hemoglobin? Acidity. Remember, it has normal pH when it's sitting there in the regular circulatory system, but it gets into the cells, and it becomes a little more acidic from not having good oxygen flow. That releases more oxygen, so it goes into the cells and kind of improves the oxygen saturation in the cells. Remember that? So it binds in the circulatory system, it releases in the distal tissues because the pH came up. So we see this pH change affecting how those drugs work. All right, when we come to the story of aspirin. I mentioned that aspirin doesn't like to cross some of these different linings. It will as long as it is
Injected.
non-ionized, right? As long as it has an ionized, it will start to cross. So when we take aspirin and put it in the stomach, it'll ionize relatively well and it'll move over. It will stay unionized and just move over. Once it gets in a pH that's a little more alkaline, and 7.4 is alkaline, then what happens? It tends to ionize. Well, now what happens with this ionized stuff? It doesn't come back across. Remember, diffusion tells us it should keep moving toward equalness on both sides. When we have this ionized process, if it's not ionized over here, moves over here and gets ionized, now it can't get back. Which is where the term trapping comes in, or partitioning. We can move stuff over in a higher level simply because of the structure of the thing and how it changes based on the pH. We use this information sometimes in trying to eliminate drugs. If I have a drug that I know will react differently if what's called alkalizing the urine, I can give somebody bicarb, it actually helps remove a drug. What did it do? Well, it changed the pH of the blood or the substance I'm trying to give so that it forced it to move. Then when it moved the other way, it got trapped, and now we can eliminate it. Again, knowing how the drug works, we end up being able to do that. We find a lot of overdoses. You'll hear about the fact they want to give bicarb to ionize the drug, or to alkalize the urine to ionize the drug to get it to come out. There are a lot of things that will affect how drugs get absorbed. The rate of how well it actually dissolves. If you have a rock, how long would a mineral rock be able to get all of its minerals? Let's say, a 1-a-day vitamin. How long would it take to be in your stomach before it got all the vitamins? Well, a whole lot longer than we think apparently now. So how quickly it dissolves. Why is it that BC powder works so much faster than an aspirin?
It's in powder form.
It's already been broken up at one point, so it's easier to dissolve when it's slower. That's one of the reasons why Alka-Seltzer really kind of works really good. It's already halfway broken up on its way to getting into the stomach. So a lot of drug companies know that and they use that information. The surface area, the greater the surface area increases the absorption. If I take just a little bitty drop of that nitroglycerin paste and I just put it all right there, there's a big pile of it right there. How long is it going to take to absorb?
Wow.
A while. If I take that same thing and I spread it out all the way down my hand and arm, So I have this nice thin coat.
Instant.
Yeah, it's going to absorb relatively quickly, maybe even dangerously. So knowing how I use surface area versus absorption is kind of an important thing. Some drugs are going to absorb faster in certain areas depending on how we use them. More commonly, think about this one. Why are drugs more likely to absorb faster in the intestine than the stomach?
Microvilli.
Yeah, it's kind of both what you said. You said it's what the intestines are for. The stomach is not an absorption substance. It's a breakdown place, right? It's like trying to say I'm going to put something in a washing machine and get it to absorb. It doesn't work very well, does it? Because all it does is sits and tumbles. When I look at the intestines, because of the microvilli, I've got these little finger things sticking up, increasing the surface area. It's very likely the drugs that come in contact with something get absorbed. So we change, it's because we increase surface area, how much likely that drug is to work. Blood flow is another thing. If we have really good blood flow, you know, if I put a tourniquet on my arm and put nitroglycerin right here, what's going to happen?
That's not gonna go anywhere.
Nothing. Until I take it off and you can just watch the whole thing. Okay, it may not do that. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? Be a great magic trick. Put a tourniquet on, a little dab there, just watch it absorb. But without blood flow, it really doesn't do anything. So if I have a person in cardiac arrest, how come I don't just give IM epi?
Because
How come I can't just hit them over and over and over and over again with an EpiPen?
there's no circulation.
There's no circulation, right? If the heart's not pumping, if they're not moving it, it really doesn't work. So the best way to really increase something in the blood flow is actually put it in the bloodstream. If we have poor circulation, we just give it directly into the bloodstream, and that works. The greater the blood flow, faster the absorption. You want to get someone to absorb things real quick, make them run around the block right after you inject it. Get their heart rate up. Solubility in water is also very important. Now, solubility of water is kind of a one-way thing. It really works at trying to get absorption across certain things like the gastric lining, but it's actually really important in removal from the body. We want water absorption to help get a drug out through the kidneys, because we want it to be water soluble to mix in with all the waters we're removing. Lipid solubility is probably a more important thing for most cases, because why? That we've already talked about.
So drug.
Across the cell membrane.
Cross the cell membranes into those cells. It's really, if it's lipid soluble, we don't have to worry about the proteins, all the different channels. We don't have to worry about receptor sites. It just sucks right through, and that's great. The more lipid soluble something is, that's great. Lipid solubility goes in the brain with no problems, goes across all the membranes real good. Could be dangerous if we didn't want it in the brain, but hey, take the good with the bad. We also have to worry about resistance to acidity. How are most drugs in the world given? Orally. We always think, oh, they're given IV. Well, that's the way we give them. Most people take drugs really by mouth. You ever been to a pharmacy? Any of you go there and get your antibiotics in injectable form? Yeah, they're mostly pills, right? Well, you know, if those pills can't stand up to stomach acid, what happens?
You don't get
Nothing.
No good.
Nothing. That's good. Nothing. If they get destroyed in the stomach, nothing happens. And that could have a really good impact. We know that its resistance to acidity is very important in the oral medications. It might be why we don't make this drug as an oral pill. You have to take it in a different form. It may also be really good at altering renal reabsorption. Because if the pH of the urine becomes very acidic and it can't work and kind of gets broken down, it doesn't come back into the bloodstream. So we actually get rid of it rather than reabsorbing it and having it back with us. Now, it's interesting, we look at resistance to acidity. I told you about naloxone or Narcan. Naloxone is the generic, Narcan is the trade, so quit using Narcan. At least using the name. Naloxone is actually in over-the-counter Demerol, or Darvon. Hey, so you buy this, you don't buy much Darvon anymore, but it used to be this narcotic you could buy over the counter as a pill. Why would it have naloxone in it?
So you don't feel the effects of the narcotic.
Well, then why give the narcotic?
I don't know. What is it for?
Good guess, though. Well, you know, if I was the kind of guy who said, oh, I just need some pain medicine, Oh, wait a minute. I know that to take something by mouth, half the drug gets destroyed somewhere, so I could actually get twice as much drug if I ground it up with a little bit of water and injected it. So if I inject it, the naloxone counteracts the drug. You actually get no effect. But if I take it orally, how come the naloxone doesn't work?
It's blocked out.
Naloxone is destroyed by stomach acid. Has absolutely no effect if you take it regularly. We destroy that drug. But as far as preventing people from injecting it, grinding up and injecting it, it actually became a safety feature. So knowing a little bit about the drug, the pharmacology, people just say, we can fix the problem of people crushing this up, we'll put another drug in it. We're not actually giving it for the purpose of it, we're doing it as a safety on the back. We know about ionization, the ability to become electrically charged. What happens when we give these drugs? We know that an ionized drug doesn't absorb very easily, so we want a drug that either has the right ionization at the right time, or that is not ionized at certain points so that it has a delayed absorption. Let's just look at aspirin. Aspirin is going to not ionize in the stomach, so it absorbs quicker there. But when it gets to the intestines, it doesn't absorb as well because now we're in a pH that's changed and now it's not, or it's going to ionize, it's going to stay in the intestines, right? What does that really mean about how aspirin absorbs? If it doesn't absorb as fast in the stomach as it does in the intestines.
Delayed effect.
Not necessarily a delayed effect, but a slower absorption so we don't get the effect all at once. That's actually kind of a benefit. If we were expecting it to work in the stomach or in the intestines, we may actually want to use less drug because once it got there, it would hit them really fast because it would absorb faster. So again, knowing little things like that helps us identify and understand how we give drugs. It's really interesting sometimes. You have somebody who says, well, I take this drug by mouth, and you look at it and you say, well, that's 10 times we would give IV. Well, why is that?
Because they don't receive all of it.
They don't get it all. It may not all ionize. It may not all pass through. So to get the same dose in the bloodstream, remember when I give it IV, what am I doing?
Direct.
I'm putting it in the bloodstream. So if they need 10 milligrams, I can give them 10 milligrams. If the intestines take out a third of it, I now have to give a third more drug just to take that out. If some of it also won't cross the stomach lining, I have to make up for that. If some of it's going to get destroyed in portal circulation, I have to make up for that. So I have to look at how the drug is going to be absorbed, and that helps us understand it. So as we look at the routes, we talked about enteral, and again, enteral drugs are ones that are going to get absorbed through the intestines, and they're going to go out and get picked up by these mesenteric blood vessels, come back here to the portal circulation, where they're going to get introduced to this big old thing called the liver. What's the liver?
Filter.
It's a filter. And it's going to look at that stuff and say, you're not supposed to be here, and it's going to take it out. It could take out up to 90% of the drug. Now, if this was some toxin that you just ate in your normal diet, that's what it would be for. That's kind of a good thing, right? So it's going to take out a lot of that drug, so what we get is a lot less of it. Now, we may get more when it reabsorbs, because it's going to go through this, going to put it in the bile, it's going to put it right back in the stomach, we're going to reabsorb it. And until it actually passes out in feces, we may actually keep reabsorbing it over time. So we look at things that anything that gets into this intestinal process, and that actually occurs from kind of the backside of the mouth to almost all the way down to the backside of the rectum, anything in there gets picked up by these mesenteric vessels through the portal vein back up to the liver. All of that is considered to be the the enteral route. So that's the PO, which is oral, means pos ora. Orogastric, nasogastric really is PO through a tube. We still put it in the stomach. Deep rectal, which is par rectum. Again, we can't just use, if you just kind of put it right past the rectum, that's going to avoid the parenteral circulation. So you got to put it a little deeper than that. That could be something we want to do. We used to talk about if you can't get an IV, just take Valium and just kind of squirt it right into the rectum. Well, if you do it right into the very end of it, it works really well. You push it a little deeper, it almost does nothing. It doesn't absorb fast enough. So it all just depends on how you want to give things. Parenteral is pretty much everything else. IV is a great example because we put it directly in the bloodstream. Where did it go through portal circulation other than, hey, I'm now in mesenteric circulation, I'm going to go through it. We don't talk about endotrachea anymore. We used to use this a lot. If we couldn't get an IV, we would pour these gallons of stuff down the ET tube. Never did sound like a good idea. We finally figured that out. Interosseous, we use a different abbreviation of IO, but interosseous really, for all intents and purposes, is IV. We just got a vein by finding a bone. So it works the same way. Umbilical is another one, and I think we just call it U sometimes, but umbilical is actually IV. We're just using the umbilical vein. Only works in people under about a day old. Intermuscular is going into the muscle, so it's going to take a while to get to the muscle. The vessels have to pick it up. Subcutaneous, which actually should be SC, but we also use SQ and then just subQ, which also should be a sub-C, but again, we can't pronounce that right. But this is just a little slower than neuromuscular. We're just put in the tissue and eventually picked up by the vessels and then moved back. Inhaled or nebulized, again, kind of the same thing. Topical, I talked about just, you got a thing here, so you put stuff on here and it works right there. It didn't like go to the liver, get filtered for it, and then come back. So that one fits. Transdermal. What's that mean? Through skin. So nitro paste really kind of absorbed that mesenteric circulation. Nasal, where it just goes into the nose, which is very similar to nebulized, except this works in the nose, whereas this works actually in the lungs. Intradermal, when have you seen an intradermal injection?
TB test.
Your TB test. Sublingual, now sublingual right at the start. Again, it's in the mouth, but it isn't deep enough to be picked up by the portal circulation. So that's still parenteral. A lot of people, this is one of those things, people kind of get it wrong. They think, well, it went through the lips, it's got to be an enteral route, and it really isn't. If you look at the speed at which nitroglycerin works when you put it under the tongue, as opposed to how long it'd be if you were to absorb it, or to swallow it, totally different experience. Okay, it works very quickly. What's this word?
Cheek.
Cheek. How do you pronounce it? You like buccal? Ask a dentist whose whole world is here. Yeah, they call it buccal. They're wrong. But I always get a kick out of it. If you ask Dr. Yamada, who started off in dental school before he decided that was too limiting, he calls it buccal. You ask any other doctor, they'll call it buccal. I find it interesting that those two areas that both considered doctors don't fit. The rectal is shallow, and here we had rectal deep, here's rectal shallow. Again, we're not going deep enough to get that portal circulation. If we look at some of the characteristics, what is it that make these things work? Well, intravenous is very quick. Why is intravenous so quick to get it in the bloodstream? Because I put it there, and the whole goal is to get it in the bloodstream. So it's instantaneous, it's already there, and it's complete. How much of it did get in there? Well, if you had a good IV, all of it got in. The risks are irreversible. I did see somebody one time that pushed some drugs, and it was in a scenario, so it wasn't really going to kill anybody. I just got looked and said, do we usually give that IV push? Isn't that usually a drip? And he said, oh yeah, you put the thing back in, pull it back out, put it in the back. I would have been real impressed if we'd have measured that and it was all drug. No blood, no other things. But we can't really reverse it once we put it in there. There's a risk of fluid overload. I mean, how much epi at 10 milliliters a thing can you give to somebody before they start to just kind of swell? There's a risk of infection. Why?
Because you're introducing a foreign.
Yeah, what if I didn't have a nice clean site? It definitely can have the problem. Possibility of embolism, because what if I didn't get all the air bubbles out? I'm injecting it right into a vein. Intermuscular is a little bit slower. We have it depending on the solubility of the drug and the blood flow. Remember, I put it in the vein. If I don't have good veins moving through the muscle, it may not absorb quick, so I need that good blood flow. The risks are it's discomforting. Now, there's a little comfort or discomfort with this too, but once. But let's go back and say, okay, I can't get an IV, so I'm going to just start giving somebody epinephrine IM every time. You know, that's going to be really sore. When you're in the hospital and you got an IV and they keep coming every 2 hours and giving you more medicine, that's comforting. When they have to come in every 2 hours and give you a shot in your butt, you're going to be really tired of it. It's relatively inconvenient, not necessarily more than this, because you still have to roll them over, roll your pants down, swab it each time. There's a potential for nerve damage, because once that needle goes in, we really don't know where it's going. We hope we know where it is, but over time, we're not going to keep using the same hole over and over again. That's leak. I said that'd be a great plan. Put it in a catheter, leave it, but probably wouldn't. Oral, we really have a highly variable absorption. Depends on the person. Depends on a lot of different things that have to do with it. depends on the solubility and stability of the drug. So not all oral drugs work as fast as other oral drugs. The gastric intestinal absorption, how fast is your stomach working? What kind of gastric emptying do you have? If you're kind of bloated and not moving, even aspirin won't work very well. If it's not moving, it doesn't get anywhere. If there's already food in the gut, it could be a good thing or a bad thing. Some drugs work better with food, some don't work well if there's other things being absorbed and it has to wait its turn. Also depends on what that food is, because some of the foods actually interact with the drug. And grapefruit in most drugs is a bad idea. Also, co-administration of other drugs. You take 2 Tylenol and 2 of this and 2 of this and 2 of this, and again, it's just waiting its turn to come in. And they may actually start to chemically fight, both in the stomach, in the blood. Drug coatings. Why do we put a coating on some pills?
Keep it from being absorbed for a certain amount of time.
It's the exact purpose. One is it makes it easier to swallow. It doesn't taste as bad as the powder. But the other is it has to dissolve first. It lessens how quick that drug dissolves. Gives it a little more time to be effective. Might increase the safety of how quickly it absorbs. But it may also slow down how quickly it works. It just depends on what it is. All right, so there's our absorption. Once we absorb it, now it's in the bloodstream, how do I get it places? So this is distribution, and distribution is how we transport a drug through the body and then across those tissue membranes. And one of the easiest things, one of the first things we have is something called protein binding. This is where a drug binds to a protein and then becomes pharmacologically inactive. Once it's bound, it does nothing. Then we end up with this bound drug, or a bound-unbound process. Some of them are bound, some of them are free. And then we see a pH effect that may release these things later on so they go do their actions. Tell me you've heard of this before.
Oxygen.
Yeah, oxygen. That process of oxygen on what?
Hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin. That oxygen-hemoglobin relationship that you all should know a lot about by now is an example of protein binding. The oxygen comes in, and remember our process, about 90% of it gets bound onto the hemoglobin. About 10, maybe 5% is left as free gas. SpO2, saturation, PaO2. Once it goes into the tissues and the pH changes, it starts to release them and off-go the oxygens into the tissues. When the pH is a little bit more alkaline, more normal for the body, it binds really well. Once it gets into where the pH changes, it starts to release it more. So we actually see 2 effects here, right? We see that ionization process going because of pH, and we see the binding of the drug to start with. Oxygen is not the only drug that does that. A lot of drugs work that same way. It gets picked up in the bloodstream, binds on the protein, not always hemoglobin, but sometimes it is, and then off it goes and unbinds when it gets into more acidic areas. And that's a good way to make sure it doesn't just all get used up right away, which is kind of why it works so well with oxygen. When we look at this, it works really good, except in a few places. One of the places is the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, if you look at the model here we have little pores that drugs go through without problems, but here these little pores have got little barriers in them. Things can't easily move through that. There's literally a barrier between a blood vessel and the brain tissues. That's there as a safety. The brain is very sensitive. It doesn't need every drug you have just going and bombarding the brain. It doesn't need chemicals and other things just bombarding the brain. So it's really picky about what can cross this blood-brain barrier. Usually to cross it, it can't be protein bound. We already knew that. It has to be lipid soluble because the only way to get across here is to actually move through the cells of the vessel, not through the pores. And a lot of times it has to be carried by a transport enzyme. Not always, but that's a way to do it. So it can either pass, if it's lipid soluble, it can pass straightly through, or if it has that transport process, it can be carried through. And again, this really protects us along the way as far as injury, but it could also be an obstacle to pharmacologic treatments. Remember what we said about Parkinson's disease? What causes Parkinson's? lack of dopamine. How come we just can't give a patient dopamine?
Doesn't cross.
All across the barrier.
Dopamine won't cross the blood-brain barrier. We have to give a chemical precursor to dopamine, levodopa, which will then cross the blood-brain barrier, and then when it gets into the brain, it turns to dopamine. And we can do that until the body gets used to it and says, oh, no, I'm smarter than that. You can't defeat me like that. And then we have to keep using stronger and stronger drugs to try to create dopamine in the brain. Well, we always fix Parkinson's the first week. The second week it comes back. The third week we fix it again with a new drug. Works for about another month and breaks again. It's always an ongoing battle with Parkinson's. So there's good sides and there's bad sides to this blood-brain barrier. We have a similar barrier in the placenta. Now, there's a misconception about the placenta. A lot of people have this idea that mom has her blood vessels, the placenta comes along and it ties these blood vessels directly. So there's a direct blood flow between mom and the baby. Okay, that's not true. What they do is they do this. So the vessels are very close to each other. There's actually a barrier between them. And mom's nutrients and oxygen comes in this way. Baby's waste products and stuff comes in this way. And through simple diffusion, they equalize. As long as it can cross that placental barrier. Now again, to do this, it's better if it's lipid soluble. And again, the protein or the polar drugs and the bound drugs don't cross. So really, we have to have nice lipid soluble drugs. Now again, remember we said lipid soluble is very common, right? So unfortunately, we have an awful lot of drugs that cross that placental barrier. Not necessarily a good thing when mom has problems and we can't treat her because it'll affect the baby. Again, we may not know this. Why?
Haven't tested it.
We never tested it. We never really looked to see what happened. Sometimes they do use pregnant guinea pigs. Apparently, they don't care so much about their young. All right, so we talked about absorption, we talked about distribution. Let's look at biotransformation. Biotransformation is what we call metabolism of a drug. Drugs don't always come in as a drug and then leave as a drug. They come in, and just like we talked about L-DOPA, crosses on becomes L-DOPA, they're going to change what they do. And sometimes we want it to change first and then be active. Sometimes we want it to go in and then be destroyed and become less active, depending on how we want that drug to work. Most drugs are going to be metabolized in the liver. This is our metabolism workhorse. It's where most things happen. Some things happen in a few other places, but we're going to use this as our big example. And they usually work here through what we call the hepatic microsomal enzyme system, or in short, the P450 system. The P450 system is just a simple process of changing a drug in certain ways. And some things will enhance this, some things will kind of destroy this. We also bring up the idea of first pass metabolism, where that drug that was absorbed by your stomach and your intestines get picked up by the portal circulation, goes into the liver, and again, 90% of it gets filtered out, stored in bile, and shot back into the stomach through the bile, and then has to go through that whole process again. So that first pass metabolism means we're not getting all the drug. We're breaking a lot of it down first. So that really filters out most of that drug. Can it come back in later? A little bit weaker, a little bit less effective? Sure. So actually what it means is we get the drug over a little bit more time than right away. But again, we also know some of it's going to leave in feces, so we have to give more through a normal route because of that. When we see this stuff, having this metabolism process come in can alter, good way or a bad way, it can accelerate the renal excretion of a drug. I can bring a drug that was more lipid soluble, send it to the liver, make it more water soluble, and now what's going to happen?
Can we absorb these?
As soon as it gets to the kidney, it's just going to get kicked out. That's water soluble, it's going to go right with all the other water leaving. So making it more water soluble, like changing it into water soluble, it tends to leave better. We might also have some drug interactions coming from this. We have two drugs fighting for the same metabolism, it may not really work. It's hard for it to do that. We could increase the therapeutic actions because of that. Or I said if there's one thing that affects the P450 group and it actually accentuates anything else that happens, we actually could take more of the drug and metabolize it and make it more useful. We'll see an example of that in a minute. It could also cause the activation of something we call prodrugs. Prodrugs are ones that are pharmacologically inactive when we first give them to somebody. So we have to give it to that patient, have the liver change it, and then it becomes metabolized and useful. Now that would be a safety thing. We want to give this drug, and it doesn't do anything until it's been through the liver several times, and every time this drug is a prodrug, moves to the liver, now it becomes useful. We may actually be extending the life of the drug, making it last over a longer period of time. We could also change the toxicity to make it more toxic, less toxic, depending on whether we're going up or down in that metabolic rate. And again, each drug would be different, so we kind of have to learn that if we give a drug over a certain period of time without letting enough time for elimination to occur, we could be increasing or decreasing the toxicity. Other things that change how well a drug is metabolized, well, one of the first things is age. We have a very limited capacity in infants for the liver to do anything. Liver doesn't work very well in infants. So I pretty much have to give a drug that's going to be able to go in and get out without having to be metabolized, because I can't count on the liver to metabolize it. And that continues until the kid's about 2 years of age. About 2 years, their liver is going to be more closer to fully functional. Why is it a problem in the elderly?
Because it doesn't work as good.
It's starting to shut down.
Yeah.
So as you get older, your liver becomes less effective at metabolizing drugs. And when it becomes less effective, it just doesn't have the same effect. So the drugs may last longer, may have different problems. We kind of have to think about that. A drug that came in at a therapeutic dose will be expected to decline at a certain rate. Now it does decline, so that therapeutic dose lasts longer. Nutritional status. If we have to have a drug that needs a certain vitamin, needs a certain element, and we don't get it in our nutrition, let's just take drugs like iodine. If we don't have enough of that, that drug's not going to work. So we have to have proper nutrition for some drugs to work. We also have the competition between drugs. Some drugs, let's just take one drug that might be an upper, one drug that might be a downer. What do you suppose is going to happen?
They cancel each other out.
They probably are. May not get effective either drug. So because of the competition of what they do, and maybe that they're trying to get metabolized in the same area, one of them is, the other one isn't, it may change the effectiveness of those drugs. Eventually, once we metabolize, we have to eliminate. And this is the process of simply getting a drug out of the body. More often than not, how do we get drugs out of the body?
Excrete.
We pee it. We just get it out through urine. I don't know the percentage. I would guess 90-95% of all drugs leave through this route. And actually that may be really high, especially if you're taking pills. I'd be willing to bet half of the drugs in pills, and I don't know this, is just a guess, but actually comes out in feces. So they keep getting reintroduced back through the bile, back into the intestine. There's a good possibility you're pooping out a lot of it because of the bile into the feces relationship. A lot of drugs come out in sweat. You ever taken any certain drugs that kind of made you smell different? Yeah, because it's coming out in sweat. Garlic. It's a great drug. Most people don't realize it works as a drug. Saliva. Are you taking drugs that there's a taste in your mouth?
The salty taste.
The drug kind. It could be a salty taste, a sweeter taste, a metallic taste. Tears. This one used to be a great one. I kind of missed the old drug. It used to be birth control pills, had kind of an orangish substance in them. And if you had a woman who wore contact lenses, you could tell if she was on birth control pills. Because it would stain the contacts orange. You had this little orange halo around their irises. Expired air. Can you get rid of drugs through expired air? Give me an example of a drug we eliminate through expired air.
CO2.
That's not the drug.
Oxygen.
Oxygen is part of the O of the CO2. But that's how we get it back out, right? We just breathe it out. Other drugs come out the same way. There's a lot of drugs coming out in breast milk. Most of you guys don't have a worry about that. But, it is a concern if you are producing breast milk. So our process is we go through the whole thing. We have absorption, and depending on how you put this thing, this one has a flaw. This one came from your book. The buccal would fit here. Sublingual. Actually, I moved sublingual. It's right there. Okay, never mind. Your book probably still has it over here. But all these things, deep rectal, shallow rectal, be over this way. Here's our intro routes, our parental routes. It doesn't matter. The whole goal is to do what?
Get in the bloodstream.
Get in the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, it may bind, and as it binds as a protein drug complex, it's pharmacologically inactive. But as the pH changes, it may make it an unbound drug. Now it's pharmacologically active and it can move. So it's going to distribute through the body. Eventually it's going to biotransform. It may make it lipid soluble, which will help it do what?
Cross the membrane.
Get into the cell membranes and probably do its job. It may make it water soluble, which will help it do what? Excrete and get out of the body. Maybe we don't even have it. So it's a simple process starting at one end, working our way through the body until it finally comes out. And remember, we want drugs out of the body. You don't necessarily want them in for long periods of time. Part of that excretion kind of helps us understand how drugs work. Because when I take a drug, and also keep in mind for these graphs, for the purpose of these, you have to assume that they were taken orally. Because if you were to do this IV, where would this point be? It'd be here. It'd be wherever I put it in. Okay? So, but it would still start to do that. So we look at it orally. And let's just take, here's your aspirin. I have a headache, I took an aspirin. I took a pill. Let's just say I have a headache, I took a pill. It doesn't work for the first few minutes. Eventually you start realizing, oh, that headache's starting to go away. Well, that's where it finally got enough where we've got a little bit of an effect. Now, keep in mind, if I only gave that much and it kind of went like this, I'm going to say, oh, it's gone away. Okay, or it didn't go away. So I have to get to a point where I have the minimum effective dose. Whatever that dose is, I have to at least given that in order to get a dose for a little bit longer period of time. As soon as it drops below that minimum effective dose again, I don't get the action. Keep in mind, that's gone, but is the drug still there?
Yep.
Some of it still is, right? So that's something I have to kind of think about is where do I want to take that next drug? If you look at this, let's just say most aspirin you take over a 4-hour period. Let's say it takes 30 minutes to start here, 30 minutes to start here. The drug's actually effective in the body for 5 hours. Okay, so we take it every 4 hours because we know when that next one's going to hit. So this is the minimum effective dose. The minimum effective dose is the least amount of drug you can give to get in a dose. We also will end up with what we call the maximum effective dose. Now you'll notice that the maximum effective dose is actually less than what this line is. The maximum effective dose is for me to get the effect I want. If I give any more than this, it really doesn't change that effect. So if I double the dose, my effect didn't change. My headache doesn't go away any better at twice the amount of Tylenol than they recommend. Does it mean if I go above it, I'm going to die?
Possible.
By the maximum effective dose is termed no. The maximum effective dose really says if I give any more, I'm wasting drug. Because this drug didn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. The only reason to give a little bit more would be maybe to extend the effectiveness as long as I didn't get toxic. So the maximum effective dose is the most, or the amount of drug that I give to get the most beneficial effect. Anything more of that is just kind of a waste. Between the maximum effective dose and the minimum effective dose is what I call the therapeutic range. This is where I want that drug. This is where I think it's best used. So if I give a little bit more drug, I might actually get to a toxic dose, toxic being harmful. So I start giving that drug, and I got above the maximum effective range, but my headache was really bad. I took a little bit more. I may get to the point where I gave so much it's toxic. It's starting to be harmful to, I don't know, let's say the liver. Did it kill him? No, but it starts to hurt the liver. And if I keep doing this, it might kill him. The difference between the maximum effective dose and the toxic dose is what we call the therapeutic index. This is a safety thing. We like big therapeutic indexes. Wouldn't it be nice that if I gave 3 times this dose, that toxic dose would right there? Instead of, it's so narrow that that maximum effective dose is kind of pushing it. So I like wide therapeutic indexes, and I'll show you an example in a minute. Eventually, I may also get to a lethal dose. You give this, someone's going to die. We don't have a difference here between, that's just the lethal dose. Now again, it could be very low, it could be very high. Make a little sick, it's going to kill them, or they can be sick for a long period of time before it kills them. So it depends on the drug where that actually fits. So, and on the high side, we really have 3 different levels. I have the part where any more is not going to make a difference. If I give too much, it's going to hurt, and if I give too much, it's going to kill. Now, let's go back to that therapeutic index. We have 2 tests that we use, and we don't usually test these on people. Okay. Who wants to sign up for an LD50 test? First of all, do we know what an ED and an LD50 are?
Yes.
What's an ED50?
Effective dose.
The effective dose of a drug in
50% of the animals.
50% of the population studied, whether it's people, humans, whatever. An LD50, lethal dose. I gave this much and half the people died. Now always remember, there was a guy who wasn't even anywhere near this. You gave him, here's one. I don't want to be that guy. There's also that guy who, go ahead, this is Rasputin over here. Give me more, I can take it. He's not quite dead yet. But 50% of them are dead at this amount. So that therapeutic index, wide, if I have this drug that the ED50 is down here, and I have a wide margin for error before I get to the LD50, this has a very safe therapeutic index. But then look at this one. I'm not sure I'd want to use this drug. Because that guy who's real sensitive? He died at the point everyone else got the effective dose. There's a ED50, oh, I'm a dead guy. Worked on half of them, killed one. We really want this to be spread out a little bit more. That's a very narrow therapeutic index, very unsafe one. So we like those wide therapeutic indexes. We also know that drugs have something we refer to as a half-life. A half-life means that once it starts being eliminated, half the drug is there. Now, this is one of those things that in theory, if you do math, you'll never get rid of a drug. Why?
You'll always have half.
You'll always have half left. There's that theory that I can never touch you because I can close the distance by half. And then I can close the distance by half, and I can close the distance by half, and I can close the distance by half, but I'll never get there. Well, it's a great theory. It's not really practical, is it? And this is really kind of the same thing. When I look at a half-life, this is the time it takes for half of the drug to be removed. Another half of the drug got removed at this point, another half of the drug at this point, another half of the drug at this point. Well, what we know is it's actually removed a certain amount per hour or per minute, depending on the drug. And it's eventually going to get to 0. But when we look at a half-life deals with the elimination. We have to start off with how quickly does a drug start to eliminate. And it could be back here, it could be up here. Once we get to the point it starts to be eliminated, when half of it is gone, that's its half-life. Some drugs' half-life is 2 minutes. Okay, adenosine, have you ever heard of adenosine? What's its half-life?
Is it 5 minutes?
Depending on who you talk to, but anywhere from about 6 seconds to a minute. It's really quick. There's a reason we slam it in. It's adenosine. It's part of adenosine triphosphate. What suppose the body's going to do as soon as it sees it?
Woo!
Yeah, I need you. Come, let's build something with you. Like energy. So some drugs are long. We have a drug called amiodarone. You ever heard of amiodarone? Its half-life is 40 days. You don't really have to hang an aminophylline drip real quick. It's going to stick around for a while. So when we look at this plasma concentration, we have this little thing that the half-life tells us how long this drug is going to affect. Now, what we need to do is maintain the knowledge of where this half-life is. And also remember that may change. If I'm old and I'm not breaking this down, my half-life doubles. Or at least changes. So some drugs, because of the elderly or just because of age, are going to move out a little bit. We also know that some drugs work differently at different doses. We know that epinephrine in large doses dilates smooth muscle, right? We talked about that earlier. Any of you ever gotten sutures or watched somebody in a hospital get sutures and they sewed the people up and said, I want you to use 1% lidocaine with? They usually say, do that with 1% with. What's the with? With epinephrine. Why would I put epinephrine in lidocaine? Because in low doses it's a vasoconstrictor. so they don't bleed as I'm causing more damage as I'm putting needles through tissue. You know, most of the time you put a needle through a tissue and blood comes out the other side. That doesn't work when you put a little bit of epinephrine in there. It just kind of takes that away. Also makes it so it's not bleeding anymore. They can kind of see what they're doing. So some drugs, depending on the dose, in low doses may, and this is an example, this isn't any particular drug, but low doses they may decrease heart rate. But notice in higher doses they may increase it. Some doses they may vasoconstrict. Well, okay, but it doesn't ever kind of come up this way. Maybe it vasodilates in a different area. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. So it just depends on the drug, and the dose will dictate that. We know epinephrine does that. We know dopamine does that. A lot of drugs really do that. Actually, remember, we know that oxygen does that. In low oxygen levels, it vasodilates, and high, it vasoconstricts. We also know sometimes that to get a drug up to a therapeutic level, we have to give a drug slowly over time in order for it to happen. And really, this makes it look, oh, you just stop it, it starts going off. Well, yeah, it kind of did. Now, keep in mind, each of these drugs actually had a half-life, but we just kept giving a drug kind of in that half-life until it got up to the point that we were keeping up with the dosage. Once we stop taking it, it starts to eliminate from the body. It's actually a bad thing to do in most cases, because how would I want to get through this? Do I just stop taking the drug?
Slowly.
Slowly stop taking the drug. Start taking half the drug, or take the same drug over twice as long, so that it comes down a little bit more controlled than just slamming down. But sometimes when we take drugs, it takes a while to get to the plateau, and now they're comfortable. A lot of times when you take drugs, the first dose doesn't make you feel better, the second dose doesn't make you feel better, the third dose doesn't feel better, but after a day or two to take the drug, it starts to work. We've plateaued. All right. Anybody have any questions so far? Because that just takes us to the wonderful pharmacodynamics, which is a good place for us to stop and come pick up. So how many are so far overwhelmed already? Okay, normal feeling. Work together. Study hard, because it's a tough process. All right. Third.
So Monday's test is pharmacology?
Yep, over tonight and tomorrow. And it will be a tough one, so study a lot. All right, remember. Sir.
I have a question. Well, it's about the PowerPoints. Are we going to receive those online or through the papers only?
I have no idea. I don't do it on there.
Okay.
That would be a Harris's question.
Okay.
I wasn't worried you were getting some of them online now.
We got the last two online. He said he's going to start doing it, and it just works better for me.
Okay.
It's less paper, but I'll ask
Are you
him.
worried about less paper?
Well, no, it's like, because I do like 99% of my studying on this and in the back of an ambulance, so it's easier to just have one thing instead of carry 4.
It's easier to have that than it is to have a piece
Like
of paper
this,
that's a lot of paper.
this, and that. I can just take this, and it has all of that, and my books, and my clinical stuff. So,
You know, a few years ago, we tried doing all the PowerPoints and so that everyone have electronically, and they all printed them. That's when I get something electronic, first thing I do is I print it, because I want the paper. All right, so let's look at the pharmacodynamics. What are we looking at as far as actions of drugs? What do drugs actually do once they hit the body? So yesterday we looked at the kinematic process, the pharmacokinetics of how it moved, got in, got out, moved about, changed. Now we're going to look at what they actually do inside the body. And really we're going to see essentially 4 basic things happen. One is it can change the physical properties of a cell. It changes its osmotic balance. Essentially what that means is it pushes things out or sucks things in. Remember osmosis? If we change that osmotic balance, it may bring other substances in more easily. It may push other things out more easily. We also could chemically combine with some other chemicals, and this one isn't really a cellular thing. It's one of those kind of the exceptions to the rules of we take a cell and we make it go faster, slower, off and on. This one doesn't even involve cells at all. If we look at the example, acid reduction with antacids and bicarb, where's that taking place?
stomach.
in the stomach. We just give something to kind of neutralize the excess stomach acids. Now, some of that stuff can actually occur, like with bicarb, in the bloodstream. Remember metabolic acidosis? What's a good way to treat metabolic acidosis? Give them sodium bicarb. We give them the sodium bicarb, it kind of neutralizes the acid in the blood. Overall, it has kind of that same effect as in the stomach, but again, it still isn't working directly to the cells. We can also alter a normal metabolic pathway of a cell. And this is where we look at things like antiviral medications, some anti-cancer medications, which actually the two are very closely related. What we're looking at is we're taking a cell and we're saying, okay, this virus has attached. What does it now need? And if we can take away its needs, we kind of deactivate the virus. Some of that same stuff occurs with anti-cancer medications. With some of the anti-cancer medications, what we want to do is we want to disrupt the normal metabolic process of cell growth and division. Remember the drug we talked about last night that grew flippers? This is what they're using it for now. It's an anti-cancer drug now. Because what they realized was in utero, what this thing did was it altered the rapid cell division when people needed to grow limbs. So as an anti-cancer drug, it does kind of the same thing. It goes in and finds these cancerous areas, and it alters that rapid cell division so the cancer can't spread as quickly. So sometimes we find one drug doesn't work very well, it works great in another place. We also have the thing we talked about the other day with the antigen-antibody reactions, is we have this lock and key thing where we have a receptor site that it doesn't just let anything in there, it has to have the right key to go in and then make it work. That is probably one of the most common examples we see, but it's not really the most common way that it works. A lot of these things are probably a little bit more common. When we look at these, they all involve receptor sites, or the majority of them. Again, this one doesn't take a receptor. When we deal with a cell, to make a cell do something, we need to have a receptor site on it. So receptors are what?
Proteins.
Usually proteins. Remember the term, the phospholipid bilayer is studied with proteins. The proteins are those receptor sites. And they may be small clusters of them, they may be really interestingly woven little proteins, but they're all just little proteins. So we have several things that could happen. One is I have a cell membrane embedded enzymes, where all I have to do is hit a receptor to it, and it triggers this particular protein to cause an effect inside the cell. So the example here is that this substance turns into this substance. Or in some ways it just releases a little substance on its own. But it takes that drug, that chemical, and keep in mind a lot of times these are chemicals in the body that are there naturally. We give it as a drug to supplement it or to enhance it. It just hits this and then we get this increased effect or different effect. We talked about the ligand-gated ion channels the other day. Remember we talked about how some drugs get in? Well, some substances get in only after another substance opens the channel. So we have this thing that comes along, it hits this particular area on the channel now opens, and now it's permeable to ions. Probably not other things. So it's going to allow very specific ions to go through. We have sodium channels, we have calcium channels, we have chloride channels, we have potassium channels. They're all going to be very specific to that one particular ion. And quite often, one way. They can go in and can't get out. They can go out and can't get in. The one that's really kind of fun, I call this kind of biological mousetrap, is the G protein coupled receptor systems. This is a system where this weird kind of interesting little protein has a drug that hits it, or a chemical that hits it, and it just kind of takes it and kicks. When it kicks, it hits another chemical, which works onto another protein that then causes an effect similar to what we had over there. So it's that mouse. You remember what mousetrap is?
Yes.
You have a clue what I'm talking about? Okay, so that game's still there. Okay. Because when I say things like, you can't leave this class till you can take the pebble from my hand, everyone says, well, show me the rock. Anyone know what I just said? Two of you who either are laughing because they think that's really silly, or you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's my age detector right there.
Sorry, I totally understood, sir.
So anyway, as this thing kicks out, we get this effect down here. Now this is also where we see a second type of process come in, and that's what we call second messengers. There actually is a second messenger that comes out here between this one and this one that tells it to do something. So this drug really doesn't react on this without another intermediate here in between. So that other intermediate is what we call the second messenger. The most common second messenger we have, we refer to as CAMP, or some people just call it CAMP, or cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Have you heard of adenosine monophosphate, or at least one of its cousins?
Yes.
Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So this is just one phosphate, not three. But that is probably one of our more common second messengers that exists in the body. For a drug to work, for a drug to be drawn to these receptor sites, it has to have a couple of things. Actually, to be drawn there, it has to have affinity. For it to do something, it has to have the second thing, which is efficacy. So affinity is how it's drawn to it. Efficacy is when it gets there, can it do anything? Hey, I have an affinity for 6-foot-tall blondes. Not a single bit of efficacy. I'm drawn to them all the time. I get there, nothing happens. Well, usually something happens. The police show up. It's a sad scene. A lot of tears. Most of it. So affinity is, can you get there? Efficacy is when you get there, does anything happen? And quite often, we actually give a drug that has a high affinity. We don't want an efficacy. There are times this is actually the benefit. Some of you might be thinking about why that would be. I'll explain it in a minute. So if something is drawn to something and works, we refer to that as an agonist. So if I have a morphine receptor site and the morphine comes into the body and hits that receptor site, it causes pain relief. Okay, that's an agonist. It is in the benefit of that particular process. So an agonist simply comes in, binds, does its job. An antagonist is one that works against. Okay, agonists work for, antagonists work against. These would have a high affinity for a receptor site, but when they get there, nothing happens. But that's kind of a good thing when I've overdosed my patient on morphine, because this agonist or this antagonist now gets in there and prevents the morphine from coming in and doing anything. So when we use a drug like naloxone, okay, the Narcan that I told you to quit using the term Narcan, this is a drug we use that reverses narcotic overdoses. Someone is overdosed on heroin, we give them some naloxone. The naloxone comes into these receptor sites, has no effect on the receptor site other than going, ooh, it's cozy here, and stays. So once it does that, what happens? All the morphine in the world can't do a thing. Sort of. But right now, let's just say it can't do a thing. It's blocked. So we refer to these as having blockers. Okay. Antagonists are essentially, not all of them are considered blockers, but it kind of does the same thing. Alright, so can the agonists come in and cause the effect? Both of these, agonists and antagonists, have an affinity, but only the agonists have an efficacy. Antagonists have no efficacy other than the effect of not allowing the agonist to do its job. There are times that we have various levels of antagonism. One of the ones that is kind of a good thing is a competitive antagonism. With competitive antagonism, we have a problem that could be considered surmountable. Now keep in mind that morphine, when it comes into these receptor sites, doesn't necessarily stay there. It hits, goes out, comes, finds another one, hits, goes out. If we had a whole lot of morphine in there and I gave someone naloxone, the naloxone really wouldn't work if these morphine things stayed in here. Right? The nice thing is that they don't. So what we end up with is a process of a competitive antagonism. It actually goes in and it doesn't push the morphine out, it just waits for it to open up and takes that parking spot. But when it sits in here, it really is kind of doing a good job of keeping it from having the effect it wants. Now, the other side to that is that when we say it's surmountable, I could even give more morphine or heroin and override the naloxone. Okay, it's competitive. Whichever one has the highest, kind of the highest quantity for its ability will actually take control. That's different from a non-competitive antagonism. This is insurmountable. Every once in a while, we have drugs that have such a high affinity for this receptor site, it doesn't leak. You can give it all the other good stuff you want, it's not going to leak. Can you think of an example of that? Dealing with hemoglobin? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has an impressive affinity for hemoglobin, 300 times that of oxygen, right? Isn't that what everyone was taught in EMT school? Okay, really high. Not quite that high, but it's good. So when we give somebody oxygen, does that automatically make them better? No, quite often it does nothing until we pressurize the oxygen and really force it in there. But actually, carbon dioxide actually gives up after about 30 minutes. So by the time we usually get them therapy, they were getting better anyway, or it already did. But don't tell anyone that because they're making a difference. So we look at the non-competitive antagonism. This is a process we can't overcome, so this is insurmountable. We have a drug that has a non-competitive antagonism. It's really a waste of time to try to give more of another drug. You have to let it wear off. Occasionally, we also have what we call agonist antagonists. And this is an example, and the case we'll use here is a drug called nalbuphine. A lot of people refer to it as Nubane. It's a synthetic narcotic. And this synthetic narcotic has an affinity for pain relief. Okay, it's drawn to those morphine receptors. It's not quite as good as morphine. So if I give this thing, let's say I have someone who has a pain of 10, I give them a little bit of nalbuphine, it gets down to an 8, wow, that's not good enough. I better go to morphine. Well, if I give them morphine, it's not going to work. Because it is an agonist as far as getting its effect, but it's an antagonist as far as the natural narcotics. Okay, so the normal dose of morphine won't work. But what did I just say? Aha! The normal dose of morphine won't work. Because this type of antagonism here is a competitive or surmountable. I could give them more than the normal dose of morphine and start to get the effects I want. So it's a agonist competitive antagonist, at least in this example. Not all are, but some can be. And knowing that about the drugs, which ones you're dealing with, is going to be kind of a helpful thing. That was one of the things that Parkland was real concerned about. A lot of people decided not to use morphine to treat burns, so they started using Nubane. Everyone said, well, if we give them that stuff, you're not going to be able to treat them with morphine at the hospital because it's a competitive or antagonist. And all the burn doctors said, use whatever you want. We'll just give them gallons of morphine until we get the effect we want. And Parkland's good. They give you lots and lots of morphine. If you ever get burned, you want to go to Parkland. If you end up at
GPS.
no,
Baylor?
I'd never go there. What's the other burn hospital in this country, in this state? Dempsey, Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. They believe in curing pain with hypnosis. They'll give you Tylenol, but other than that, it's you do not hurt. Apparently, if you're that kind of military,
military
you don't hurt,
hospital.
right? Yes, sir.
Saves money.
Yeah, and it's
Suck it
cheaper.
up.
All right, now when we talk about efficacy, efficacy has different levels. I shouldn't necessarily say that those tall blondes that I have the affinity to, that I have no efficacy. I do if they're really broke and kind of ugly. Okay, but you know the hot supermodel ones, you know, like Carrie Walsh. Have you ever, you know who Carrie Walsh is? She's like 6'8" and on the volleyball team. No efficacy there whatsoever. Won't even return my phone calls, none of the emails, my Valentine's. When we compare different forms of efficacy, we have different effects. So if we look at a couple of drugs, here's a synthetic narcotic called Talwin or pentazocine. This particular drug has a pretty good efficacy. Okay, it's not bad, But if we were to compare that to a drug called Demerol, it has a much higher efficacy in similar doses. So not all efficacies are the same. We also compare that a little bit to potency. How much drug does it really take to start getting the effects? If we look at morphine and Demerol, they'll both cause the same effect eventually, but I have to give a whole lot less morphine than I do of Demerol to get the same effect. Okay, so that's potency. Efficacy is how much effect we get. Potency is how much we have to give to get the same effect. And they do vary a little bit. We should probably be using a drug called fentanyl. Fentanyl has a very good affinity. It's also a synthetic narcotic, but it comes up here and it will have almost the same potency. The problem is it won't last near as long. It actually has a higher efficacy. It just doesn't last as long as the morphine. All right, now keep in mind all of these things we're talking about are dealing with receptors, and receptors are what? Proteins. Proteins get used up relatively easily. They're not really a high endurance molecule. So when we start seeing receptors get used a lot, the body kind of has to decide what to do with these receptors that are getting used up. And we have a potential for one of two things. We can either have down regulation, where the body says, nope, you get 10 of them, you're down to 8. You're down to 3. And that's down regulation. We have a decrease in the number of receptor sites because these proteins get destroyed. So the next time I give a drug, it's harder to find those receptor sites. So eventually, we may not even get the effect out of the drug. People who take lots and lots of narcotics eventually find out they don't work.
So is this like tolerance?
It's a form of a tolerance. This one isn't necessarily a psychological tolerance. It's a process where the drug just simply doesn't work anymore. It is a form of the tolerance issue. You can define tolerance in a few other ways. Now, upregulation is kind of the other side. The body says, oh, you keep using these things. You know, we made 2 thinking you need them. You've used them both. You need more. So the body starts getting an increase in these receptor sites, and the downside to that is you give the same dose of the drug the second time, and it really hits. Now, that's a rarity. It's kind of an idiosyncrasy. We'll talk about it in a minute, but it's a potential that you have to kind of be careful a second or third or fourth time you administer a drug because of that little idiosyncrasy, a little twist.
Is that up to the individual person how they react to it, or just
In some cases
drugs?
it is. There are a few drugs we know that works for. None of the pre-hospital drugs, but you never know what we'll get tomorrow. All right. As far as receptor sites and the basics, you got that?
Yes, sir.
All right, then let's look at things that change it. If we look at drug interactions, drugs can interact with other drugs. And one of the things that we get is an intensification of the effects. If I give one drug and then another drug and those drug effects are really high, we call that potentiation. We're increasing the therapeutic process, or at least we're hoping to. Example here is 2 antibiotics. We almost never use this antibiotic alone. It's almost a waste of time to give this drug alone. Ampicillin was great a few years ago. We have so many better things that we don't see it used alone anymore. But a lot of physicians will use both of them together. You put them together, it's one of the best antibiotic teams we've got. Because they potentiate each other. You know, it's like 2 weak guys, they egg each other on, they get it, the team wins. We also have a downside that if you potentiate 2 drugs, they might actually produce their side effects worse. Like aspirin, which is a drug we use to inhibit platelet coagulation, and warfarin, which is
Brave food.
Blood thinner.
it's a blood thinner. It's actually rat poison, but we won't get into that. They actually found it by people who were eating rat poison, and all of a sudden their blood got thinner. It just kind of inhibits clotting. But we modify these things, we put them both together, there's a good possibility they'll start bleeding. They don't even have to have a wound, they'll start bleeding. Because both of those drugs make the platelet process so weak they really don't even work at all. We also could have a reduction in effect. We put 2 drugs together and they reduce what happens. So we speed them up its potentiation, we bring them down its inhibition. And this could reduce therapeutic effects. Drugs like propranolol and albuterol. Well, we talked about albuterol the other day. This is what we call a beta agonist. Okay, so it is in favor of working the beta adrenergic system. Propranolol is a beta blocker. If I give you those two drugs together, what's the end result?
Nothing.
Nothing. They kind of cancel each other out. Okay? It's like offensive pass interference and defensive holding at the same time. Nothing happened. We also can reduce adverse effects, and this is kind of a good thing. We talked about this relationship, morphine and naloxone. By putting them two together, one blocks the other. We actually end up again with no effect, but in that case, that's actually what we wanted. So again, knowing how the drugs work gives us the benefit. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing, sometimes it's a good thing. Depends on what it is and how the drugs come together. We also know that drugs and food don't always go together very well. Depending on what it does, it could affect, pick one, increase or decrease the absorption of the drug. How does it work? And that could be a bad thing. Decreasing just means the drug doesn't work very well, but increasing can be a really bad thing. If I increase the dose of a drug simply by eating a grape with it, that's a bad thing. So when I look at things like aluminum-containing antacids and any citrus, I actually increase the absorption of aluminum. Is aluminum bad for us? Well, in high amounts it can be. We're also thinking it may have one of the conditions that might bring on Alzheimer's. When we increase aluminum, we didn't get a lot of aluminum in our diet back in the 1800s. Now that we're having a lot more aluminum, because it's in the pans we used to cook with, we're starting to see Alzheimer's too. Could also be people who live in one. Do y'all know what theophylline is? You ever heard of theophylline? Theophylline it's called the xanthine derivative. Another xanthine derivative is, what's the name of that stuff? Oh yeah, caffeine. So this is essentially giving the same drug twice. Theophylline is used by people who have asthma, COPD. They may take it as a home medicine. We used to give it as a drip in aminophylline, which is simply theophylline with ethylene diamine added to it. We put the two together, you have really kind of a really bad combination. What kind of drug is caffeine? What's it do for us? Stimulants. So we give somebody another stimulant, put the two together, we can get some pretty excited people. These kind of people, here's a little bit of theophylline, here, drink this cup of coffee, and run around the block in 2 minutes. They can pretty much do it. Those are the people you want to come over and clean your house. Potassium-sparing diuretics. A diuretic is a drug we use to make people pee. But when you pee, most of the time you don't care what's in it. You just pee. You just flood stuff out. By giving a potassium-sparing diuretic, we make sure the potassium levels never drop below certain amounts. If we have a potassium-sparing diuretic like spironolactone, and we give them salt. Now most salt is simply sodium chloride, but a lot of salt is actually a mixture of sodium chloride and potassium chloride. And it's usually both. That could cause a really big increase in potassium, couldn't it? If I'm giving them potassium and tell them not to pee out excess potassium, what's going to happen with my potassium level, do you think?
It's gonna go up.
It's going to go up. How dangerous could that possibly be?
Can you start to hurt?
Yeah, what do we use to, let's say we don't kill people. We,
Overdose.
we don't put them to sleep. When we do lethal injection, but apparently it doesn't kill people or put them to sleep or anything. What drug do we use?
Potassium.
Potassium. So if that level gets too high, their heart's going to have big problems and maybe stop, which most people are against. I'm not against it if they did something that bothered me. Monoamine oxidase. Have you ever heard monoamine oxidase? I'd be willing to bet everybody in here has heard monoamine oxidase. You probably haven't heard the words, but you've heard somebody say the initials. If you're taking MAOIs or MAO inhibitors, you should call your doctor before using this drug. Because a lot of drugs don't go well with MAOIs. Monoamine oxidase, I'm going to talk about this later when we get into the sympathetic nervous system, is a substance used to break down norepinephrine. It's really a bad thing to have an MAOI inhibitor because now when the body makes norepinephrine, what can't we do?
Break it down.
Get rid of it. So we have it in higher and higher and higher quantities. And in certain situations, the body just knows, oh, you need to make some epi now. You need to make norepi now. You need to make norepi now. You need to make norepi now. Well, if we're not breaking it down, those things probably didn't happen. We also know that certain foods that contain tyramine or tyrosine, its derivative, are going to cause that norepinephrine to be created. And it's a good thing that most of these foods are things nobody likes. Because, no one would eat cheeses. Actually, I won't. Yeast extracts, chocolate, grapes. Actually, I don't eat chocolate either. I get a kick out of grapes. We also mean wine. Because that's, wine's made of grapes, right? For the most part? Okay. So, grapes, I always get a kick out of that too. People say you should drink a glass of wine because the flavonoids are good for your heart and all that kind of stuff. So's grape juice. That's an excuse to drink. I gotta drink the whole bottle every night for my flavonoids. A lot of other alcoholic beverages, like, what's that B one?
Beer.
Oh yeah, beer. Yeah. Pork, tofu, no one should eat that stuff. I don't know what it is. Yogurt, actually, you shouldn't eat that. You know what yogurt is?
Bacteria?
It's the bad milk. It's like, here, eat the bad stuff. Oh, it tastes good. Well, try some yogurt or some, what's this, tofu. You'll probably like that too. So, just a few things on this list that people probably would never eat. If you eat those and you're on an MAOI inhibitor, or MAO inhibitor, MAOI inhibitor, yeah, that's like TGIF Fridays. If you're on an MAOI and you eat these foods, all of a sudden your level of norepinephrine goes up. Norepinephrine causes major vasoconstriction, and you might pop. Your just pressure is going to go as you're trying to push things through narrow vessels. Here's a good one. I always love the grapefruit juice effect. No one really understands exactly why this works. We know how it works. We're not really sure why sometimes. Grapefruit juice inhibits certain drugs from doing what they're supposed to do. It doesn't metabolize them. If it doesn't metabolize them, it means they don't get broken down. So they stay active longer and at higher levels. And this sometimes could raise the blood level of that drug almost 400%. That could be a bad thing, because we don't want 400 times the drugs, actually that'd be 4 times the drug, in the body. And this occurs with relatively common drugs some of you might recognize, verapamil and diltiazem. Now most of these we're talking about a pill. When you go to someone's house and give this as an IV, you really don't always have to worry about it, but if they just ate breakfast and said I had a big glass of grapefruit juice, you might want to worry about what effects you're going to get out of it. As a pill, this one may be where you kind of start seeing problems, is they say, well, I had grapefruit juice for breakfast and my doctor put me on a brand new drug and now I feel terrible. Well, it's because of this thing. Who remembers the P450 groups? Those are the enzymes in the liver that start metabolizing the drug, right? So if this inhibits some of these drugs don't metabolize the way they're supposed to. Again, you look at some of these drugs. Here's drugs for cholesterol inhibitors. Here's amiodarone, which we use a lot in the pre-hospital setting. I don't know where you'd find caffeine, but most people probably wouldn't have that for breakfast anyway. Which, I'm kidding, right? So, well, it wouldn't? Okay. Carbamazepine is a seizure medication. Here's the one that worries me the most. I just had a glass of grapefruit juice, and I'm a little randy this morning, so I take my sildenafil, and I have a 400% increase. That's like ripping the pants off the Hulk. First of all, y'all know what I just said? You know what that is?
Viagra.
Yeah, this is one of those recreational drugs. That's the only way I can describe it. It's like you needed it. If I don't take it, I'll die. Well, maybe so. But as an erectile dysfunction drug, you have a 400% increase. Wow. Maybe they ought to just put a little bit of grapefruit juice in there with it. Well, you think she's tired of you now. All right, other adverse effects. We have side effects, and we've talked about the term side effects before. Side effects are what happens when this drug, not being perfect, does other things. But we usually consider these things to be predictable and really to not be a big major problem. It's just like, well, you might feel warm, you might get a metallic taste, you might pee blue. but that's not near as big of a worry as what we actually gave it to treat. So there are things that are there, and we should know the side effects of the drugs we give. If I have a drug that's going to make your pupils dilate, and I look at your pupils, oh man, your pupils are dilated, you're hypoxic. Is that really true? No, we know to expect that because we gave that drug, right? Toxicity is a little bit worse than the side effect. This is an adverse effect that's usually caused by excessive dosing, and most people have to take more than normal. There are a few people that are so sensitive to a drug they get toxic on a regular dose. Remember that ED50 test? There's that first guy that just whiffed it and all of a sudden had the effects. So you give him the normal dose, you're going to have a problem. Allergic reactions are a hypersensitivity to the drug. Most people wouldn't have that, but occasionally some do. Do not put side effect and allergies in the same boat. An allergy is not an expected response from someone. It may not be an unexpected problem, but it's not an expected response, where a side effect is kind of an expected other effect. How do we usually fix allergic reactions to the drug?
Stop giving it.
First one, stop giving it. And then if it still is a problem, then we can give them diazepam for the itching, or not diphenhydramine. If they have respiratory problems, we can give them epinephrine, but that just one of them fixes other problems. Idiosyncrasies are uncommon things. These are problems that we don't really think works. I have a friend of mine, if you give her a Tylenol, she'll be out cold. And she used to tell us that would work, and we didn't believe her, so we put Tylenol in her soup. And she just it's an idiosyncrasy. She has this weird thing that Tylenol makes her go to sleep. Doesn't work in everybody. Some people just know, I can't take this drug because I have a weird response to it. It's not expected, it's not norm, there's probably no statistical thing that says enough people have this. It's just an oddity, usually in an individual, not in a population. I mentioned the term iatrogenic or iatrogenesis the other day. Or this is stuff caused by physicians or caregivers. Can you think of an example of a drug that caused a disease?
Risperidol.
Risperidol?
Yeah, didn't that cause it's you were talking about last night. It's like the drug that causes male breast growth.
It's actually, there's several of them that do that now, but yeah, that's one of the ones on TV.
Gynecomastia.
Now, is that really an iatrogenic disease, do you think?
It's an alter of the body.
Okay, and that would be a problem. So we look at some of these diseases. We have some drugs that there's a potential that they could do other things to you. I always get a kick out of the commercials on TV, because what I want to do if I'm a drug manufacturer is advertise to the stupid mass media and let them pick, ooh, that purple pill, I want to surf the weight, that's for me. Oh, by the way, it may cause blindness, diabetes, heart cancer, and death in a few people. I'm still for it. I just never have quite understood why you tell someone it might kill you, that they still go to their doctor, I want this drug. Maybe they're all suicidal. But we look at those things, and these effects can occur. We know that occasionally this drug might cause cancer, that this drug might cause heart disease, it might cause diabetes. Those are expected things in some ways, but it's an iatrogenic process because it was induced by the caregiver, the person who administered the drug. A carcinogenic effect is one that specifically causes cancer. Could that be also tied to iatrogenesis? Sure. So can this one. The teratogenic effects is one that causes birth defects. That's what we talked about the other day. We give this particular drug and all of a sudden there's a birth defect. The people are not born as normal as we expect a human to be. Also considered to be a potential iatrogenic disease. When we look at adverse drug reactions, and we're going to see these occasionally, the things we have to do is ask ourselves some very simple questions. Did the symptoms appear shortly after using the drug for the first time? You give someone a drug and all of a sudden they turn plaid. Wow, that's weird. Did the symptoms abate as soon as the drug was discontinued? Stop the drug, hey, they're not plaid anymore. So we give the drug again, they got plaid again. What are you starting to think? I'm kind of thinking this is the drug. Are there any other drugs you're given that might explain this? Is the illness itself going to explain this? Is this an illness that is flashing plaid syndrome? Maybe. If you think that this is causing it, don't give the drug. But what if the doctor ordered it?
Tell the doctor that.
Tell the doctor, this person's turning plaid, we'd like to discontinue the drug. Actually, don't put it that way. Tell the doctor, this person's turning plaid, we've discontinued the drug. Do you have another drug? Or he may say, oh, that's fine, just give the other drug and it'll anti-plaid them. Sometimes you have to give 2 drugs to get. Physicians are supposed to know that kind of stuff. They don't. They're supposed to. When we look at medications over time, we mentioned the term tolerance. Tolerance is a decreased response from the same dosage. And this could be, what was the example we were using to talk about this?
Downregulation.
They don't even have the receptor sites for it. It could just be that those receptor sites are still there. They're just kind of immune to what's going on. They're so worked, they don't produce the same response. If we do things over and over again, and it just takes time to build up the stores of the chemical that we're acting on, we also may not get the same effects. A cross tolerance is a tolerance when we use one drug, but it causes a decrease in the effectiveness of a different drug. So we have a decrease because of another drug that was actually started in the first place. This one, the tachyphylaxis, the tolerance which develops after a single administration, is just a really fast tolerance. As we give it once, the next thing you know, nothing happens. Now, is that a down regulation? That could be. It'd be really odd that we used enough drug the first time to destroy all those proteins and receptor sites. So it's probably more just a common thing with that individual. Dependence is when we start needing a drug. And we can look at a drug for, I physically need the drug. Your body goes through withdrawal symptoms, through pain, has seizures because you don't have the drug. Heroin tends to do that. A psychological dependence is I just feel like I need the drug. I just have to have this drug. Quite often, these are both there. There are people who want the drug. I have to have the drug. I just have to do it. It's a psychological process. Does it really do anything to them if they don't get it? Maybe not if it's truly psychological, but if it's physiological as well, it actually will. It'll have physical properties associated with it. We also know that giving drugs also creates problems. We talked about drug interactions. Occasionally we give a drug that actually has a bad interaction. We have a drug that was supposed to be doing this, it added with another drug that's supposed to do this. We give them together, we end up seeing this. So this particular drug interacted on this one in a way that wasn't quite what we expected. An interference is one where we gave a drug that's supposed to do this plus this drug, and the next thing we know, this drug still did just fine. What happened here?
Altered.
Yeah, it altered. Didn't quite do as strong and as big as we actually expected it to. Again, if we know that one drug interferes with another, what can we do when we administer this drug? Give more of it. Again, knowing how one drug works on another is important. We also have a process of summation. This is where we give 2 drugs and their combined effects, or they're just what the 2 effects would be. You know, one drug, you may overdose on it if you give any more. Another drug may not be really safe to give twice as much of it, but I give the 2 together, it's like I gave twice as much of both drugs. Because they're kind of hitting it from 2 different angles. A cumulative effect, we kind of talked about this yesterday. We just start giving a little bit of the drug, and the more we give, the better the response over time. And so over time it gets to be a stronger, more effective dose. Eventually, hopefully, it plateaus out. You don't want one of the next thing that just takes over the screen. Synergism is an effect where the 2 drugs coming together, except where, kind of in opposition to summation, where these things just kind of did the same as both of them together. This one, they did not just what they would do together, but they actually went above it. And this is really kind of a nice thing to have. If we know what drugs do, synergistic effects are a really good way to get a big bang for your buck with very low doses of drug. And this is kind of a really nice thing if we can have it. We have a few Parkinson's drugs that kind of work that way. We actually have one, if we were to draw it out, this one would actually be really flat because it almost does nothing. We have another drug that to get this effect, we have to give 3 times as much of the drug. But you give a little bit of this one, that little bitty flat one, and you get this huge effect. That's a great response. Again, putting 2 drugs together, knowing how they works really well. We also talked a little bit about potentiation, where we have one drug that would normally do this, another one that would normally do this, give them together, and this one still did its job, this one just did a bigger job. So that's a potentiation of one drug caused by the other. It's a form of an interaction, it's just a good one. What do you suppose is going to happen if you make a mistake with a drug?
They die.
Someone might die, yeah, maybe. I have a good friend who works over the emergency room at Methodist Hospital in Dallas. It's just a little hospital. She was doing a study one day because someone got mad at her and said, okay, you need to do a paper on something. And the thing that they did was they wanted to know how many medication errors occurred at Methodist Hospital. Well, her charge nurse who assigned her that had no idea. All I had to do is call risk management and find out how many reported. So, how many medication errors do you think are reported daily at Methodist Hospital in Dallas?
12.
200.
Ooh, that's a pretty good number. About 150 a day. Okay, now let's go back. What happens if you make a medication error? People die? They could. How many of those 150 die? Yeah, almost none. Doesn't mean it's not a potential. It doesn't mean a bigger error would cause a bigger thing, but a lot of it's just stupid mistakes. And for the most part, it's also, oops, you know what? He was supposed to get his medicine at 4. I forgot. I missed a dose. He got it at 8. That's a medication error in a hospital. It isn't necessarily I drew up 5, was supposed to draw up 2, and ended up giving the whole thing, and now the person's purple. There's a lot of reasons why medication errors, and most of them are human factors. We look at human factors, we have a performance deficit. They just don't even know how to push a drug. So a drug that's supposed to go nice and slow, there are some drugs you push it fast, it'll cause devastating effects. Furosemide, which we don't use very much anymore, if you pushed it fast, your patient will become deaf. Temporarily at first, in some cases, if it's fast enough, it'd actually be a permanent problem. So performance is an issue. Knowledge deficit. They don't even know what to do with the drug. They don't even know what it does, but they're giving it. Why?
Because the
Doctor said to, yeah. They may miscalculate the dose, a very common error, because a lot of people, amazingly, still can't do math. Stress and fatigue. A lot of places are eliminating the number of long shifts they allow people who have the ability to give drugs can actually do. It wasn't uncommon a long time ago for nurses to work 16, even 24-hour shifts because they like that back-to-back overtime. Most hospitals said, no, nothing more than 12 hours. And even that's kind of being looked at now. I like the fact that communication is not a human factor, but it really is. Because who else is talking to us? Well, the rat in the corner said to go ahead and give this drug. But communication is a big issue. How we verbally say to give a drug. Give that person Zantac when I meant Xanax. And a lot of drugs sound the same. If I have a speech impediment or I have a problem hearing because it's noisy and some machine's beeping all the time, I may have heard the wrong drug. The written communication of what is there, if I don't know how to spell the drug properly, is some drugs are pretty close in spelling. You miss one, you got the wrong drug. We talked about documenting of dosages. Remember, it's 0.4, but never 4.0, right? So you need to have zeros before a decimal point, but nothing after a decimal point. Those things could change by a factor of 10 times what their problem is. Name confusion on drugs. Again, looking at a bottle and think it's the same thing. If you don't know your generics, it's going to be hard to find it. Packaging, delivery processes. A lot of drugs look alike. There was a guy in Dallas a few years ago had a diabetic problem. The paramedic looked up in the box, pulled down a purplish box that he thought was D50, administered it to him, and it turned out it was 2% lidocaine, and the patient was dead like that. It was a lethal injection. All because he didn't do what? Read the box. The colors were close. Oh, and that should have been good enough, right? Why would you have 2 colors close? The drugs are so different. That's just wrong. When we look at how we give drugs, it's very important that we follow what we call the 6 rights. And first of all, look over here at this bottle. Look how dopamine is spelled. Is that proper English structure?
No.
But what's that do for us?
Confused.
It helps us recognize this as dopamine as opposed to dobutamine, which has different stresses on its levels. So that's one of the ways that the manufacturers are helping us recognize drugs that do different things. So when we give these things, our 6 rights are we always have to pick the right medication. We look at that bottle, is it the drug we're supposed to give? Is it the right dose? Did you pull up what was ordered or needed by that patient? Are you giving it at the right time? EMS, a lot of us look at it and say, well, we don't have to worry about time, we give it now. You know, hospitals, they give it every 4 hours. We ever repeat drugs?
Epi.
Yes, sometimes.
All the time. It's important to get a drug in as a repeat dose, hang a drip within a certain window. If we don't, we have to give another bolus drug. So the time is still important. Right? Kind of almost as important as in the hospital. We have to give it through the right route. Just because one route seems to work and you don't have it doesn't mean you can just pick another. Right patient? Well, that should not be hard in EMS. Most of the time. Gosh, which patient in this ambulance should I give this drug to? Because most ambulances today only carry 1. Go look at some of the old ambulances that had hooks on the side. We could actually carry 6 patients in an ambulance. We'd literally hang them. Does anybody even know if you have a road cot in your ambulance?
I know Dallas has backboarded somebody and put them in the bench seat.
You can put them on a bench seat, but those don't always work as well. If you'll notice on some of the bench seats, there's a little kind of cutout in the cushion, a little hole there, little metal bracket. Those are for road cots. Road cot actually had a little thing that fell down. You put it in there, it was stable. We also could hang them. There'd be hooks that hung from the ceiling. You put them on some hooks on the side, then hang them there, so you could actually carry 6 patients in the ambulance. Some rural places probably still do that. Most of us just get lazy and we call another ambulance. But if you have more than one, make sure you give them the drug to the right patient. The last thing is how we document it. We have to document that we gave a drug. Why?
So the hospital knows what you gave.
Hospital knows what you gave, so they come along and say, wow, this guy needs morphine. I wonder if he's had any. Chart says none. Let's give him a lethal dose. Because you've already given him too much. Or at least just enough, and now they're going to give him too much. So document it properly is a very important thing. Now, not all of us respond as well to drugs. Certain things like body weight and composition can change the effects of a drug. How do you suppose body weight, mostly made up by fat, affects drugs?
It's going to sequester more
Why?
because it's lipid soluble.
Aha! Drugs that are lipid soluble are going to find fat and go in the fat and do absolutely nothing except store in the fat. So it may not work as well in people who are a little bit more obese. This is, and we say this nicely, drugs are not always as effective in women as they are in men. Without linking it directly to body weight, why do you suppose that is?
Women have higher fat.
Women have a higher body fat content than men do. Even skinny women still have more body fat than a comparable skinny guy. It's just the way women are built. Age has another big problem with it. We talked about this the other day. What 2 big concerns with age?
Slow down your
Slow
metabolism.
metabolism.
Yeah, those under 2, those over 60 are starting to have a change in how their liver and their kidneys start to function. When you can't get the liver to metabolize the drugs stay longer. If the kidney won't eliminate the drug, it stays longer. Those are big effects. If our age changes or our body changes acid-base balance, that becomes a problem. If we have an altered electrolyte status, that may change how a chemical process can occur because we don't have enough potassium or calcium or some other electrolyte to actually do the job we want. There's also a possibility of tolerance. I take this drug all the time because it doesn't work very well. Now, most of the time we think about that with abuse drugs, but Parkinson's is always having those issues. Some other issues associated with things like hypertension. You may have a great working hypertensive medication for a long time. It kind of stops working because your body's getting used to it. What's a placebo effect?
It's very colorful and you think it'll work.
Oh yeah, oh, and the more colorful the drug, the better off it is, yeah. Because we want to really challenge people with that. But yeah, this is just the effect of, oh, this is a very strong drug, you better you can give them sugar water and tell them it's something really impressive, and they'll believe it if they believe in the drug. Now, does that mean they didn't really have the problem in the first place? No, it's just the psychological process actually is so much stronger than the medication. It actually started to work. They believe that it worked, and it does. We use placebos mostly in what setting?
Testing.
Yeah, research, testing, just to make sure. I've seen people that don't have medication tell a patient they gave them one, the patient gets better. That's usually, I think that's more called fraud, but it does happen. We also know that sometimes just simple bioavailability of a drug changes how things work. We don't absorb well. So certain things like vitamin deficiencies don't allow the vitamins to absorb. That creates problems. There's also genetics, simple race type things. We mentioned the other day when we're testing drugs, it's a good idea not to test them in 20-year-old white males. Why? Well, we know they're not females, we know they're not kids, we know they're not pregnant. Well, does it affect races differently? Most drugs don't, but there are just enough that we do know that certain races actually metabolize drugs at a different rate, or sometimes don't even metabolize them at all. We talked about the gender in women, and again, mostly dealing with body fat, but also dealing with the fact that they have
Breasts.
a good one, and also reproductive systems that are a little bit different, right? It's the first thing you think of. Yep. And I'm all for it. But that, just the whole reproductive process, we can alter a lot of that by giving the wrong medications. Failure to take as prescribed. A lot of little old people don't have a lot of money. Their doctor says take this drug every 4 hours. They decide I'm going to take it every 6 hours. That way it lasts longer. What's the risk?
They're not getting enough.
They may never, because that process, they never hit that therapeutic level. They never get it high enough. If they can't afford to keep it going, like let's say, oh, I have to take insulin every day and I can't afford it. Kind of has some problems. Not taking as prescribed is an issue. Drug interactions, you go to your pulmonologist and he says, you have asthma, here's a beta blocker. You go to your cardiologist, say, your blood pressure's too high. Here's go to your pulmonologist, he says, you have asthma, here's a beta agonist. Your cardiologist says, here's a beta blocker for your blood pressure. Now what happens when you have a problem? Nothing. Now the problem is your blood pressure is probably fine because you take that every day. Now all of a sudden you have an asthma attack and you're dead because nothing worked. So making sure you know that's good. Also diet's kind of important. If you're not getting the right nutritional balance, if you're not eating right, drugs may have a completely different effect on you. And if you're eating the wrong things, if you are on an MAOI and you eat all the things with the tyrosine in it, you're going to have problems as well. We also know occasionally that you're going to give a drug to a pregnant person, and what are our risks? Well, the FDA has looked at it and come up with kind of a new standing, and this is really kind of an interesting way of doing it. They'll actually put in the material what their level of concern is, and this is based on what we know about it so far. And you look at these things, and an A is one that has human studies that show no risk of fetal harm. It took a lot to do human studies. More often than not, we're down here that says we don't have a problem, or we know there's a problem because there's a proven risk. Proven risk of fetal harm, which is very contraindicated. You should never give this. A lot of them are sitting in here. We don't know because we haven't done any studies. So it could be here, it could be here. We know that pediatrics have problems with a lot of areas. One, the young infants and neonates. What's a neonate?
Birth to 1 day.
1 month.
Birth to 1 month.
Those have underdeveloped gastric absorption. It just doesn't absorb well. So we give an oral drug, it may not absorb very well in the first place. Underdeveloped liver and kidneys, well, if we give somebody some drug in an adult, because of the kidneys and the liver starting to get rid of it, it goes away relatively quick. This is our minimum effective concentration. As we come up here, we're starting to see infants have a whole lot more of the drug. So what's that tell us? What do we have to do if we know this about a drug?
Give them a less dose.
Give less. Or at least the next dose doesn't come in. And again, we don't have the line up here that says what the toxic dose is. You know, this may be just fine, but we don't repeat it here. We give it over longer dosing runs. When we look at other effects on kids from 1 to 12 years of age, at about 2, the liver and kidneys really function near adult. We can say at about 1 that's sort of there. They do start to metabolize drugs faster, and faster meaning faster than this. They also can have bigger problems as far as the fact that all these drugs could affect how they're working. Remember, all these kids are trying to grow, they're trying to build new bone, they're trying to build new structures. Well, what happens to them? If we give certain things like glucocorticoids that might be given to a kid with asthma, it's going to become a really small child. And this maybe should be stunted growth. Does it look like retarded? It's just dumb. Hey, keep in mind, retarded means not developed, not progressed. So we're just not getting to be as tall, as big a kid as we thought. Tetracyclines used as an antibiotic in kids tend to give them discolored teeth. And it may occur when they still have the baby teeth that'll come in their adult teeth. Aspirin could cause acidosis, hyperthermia, Reye's syndrome. I still get a kick out of this one because Reye's syndrome wasn't a problem until Tylenol decided that nobody who'd ever gotten Tylenol got Reye's syndrome, but everybody who got it had had aspirin. So all of a sudden aspirin was to blame. It might be true of the 20 cases a year we were actually seeing of it in the first place. But everyone knows now about this very rare condition, all because Tylenol in this study found out they weren't responsible. It's kind of like that thing. We found a drug to cure a disease we just created. Adolescents between 12 and 16 years of age, we really don't have much of a change because by the time 12 to 16, adolescents really are kind of adults in function. But we do know for all of these, we really like to give drugs by weight. Even if we have to approximate the weight, it's still better than just giving it blindly. With adults, we just give everybody the same dose. Hey, when you look at a group of adults and you have little bitty 25-year-old women who are this tall and weigh 80 pounds, and you have great big huge 55-year-old guys who look like John Wayne on steroids, if they go into a medical condition, they get the same dose of a drug. Why? Good point. We have no idea why. Because we're lazy. With kids, we know they vary so much we have to be careful of the dose because we also know overdoses are more dangerous. Adults can tolerate a little more variance in a drug. Really, it's a good idea to give it weight-based on everybody. Now, what's the flaw in giving weight-based to kids? They're getting fatter. So what we used to think was the right dose, we're having to recalculate. With geriatric patients, we have similar concerns. We change the absorption of the drug. Their stomach with an increased gastric pH may destroy more drug. They may have problems with the absorption, it just doesn't get in. Their motility, it just stays in the system because it takes longer to pass through, becomes a big problem. The distribution, because of less body fat, or actually I guess that should be decreased body fat because they don't have much, decreased lean body mass, they just don't have the same fat concentrations in their body. Decreased body water, so it's actually a drier substance they're moving through, decreased cardiac output, also the metabolism from the hepatic side, excretion from the renal side. All those things make it more likely that once the drug gets in, it's going to stay in longer. So we have to be concerned with that in the elderly, that we don't have overdose them on a drug. Adverse effects in the elderly are the drug accumulation. What's polypharmacy?
Many drugs.
Many drugs. Any of you ever transported an old person to the hospital and carried the small armored vault of all the drugs they carry with them? So here's the 90 that they have. They're always on all kinds of drugs. Greater severity of illness. meaning that they have so many bigger problems that they're on a lot of different drugs, and some of them are going to be very narrow in that therapeutic index. Multiple pathologies, they just have bigger problems in general. Not just they're worse, there's more of them. Now, you go talk to a kid and say, what kind of medical problems do you have? None. You talk to an elderly person, sit down for a while because it's coming. You know, there's usually 7. A lot of times they use drugs with that low therapeutic index, as I mentioned, just because it's more with the worst conditions. That's just kind of the way we treat them. Increased individual variation. As old people get old, and keep in mind, old is not as old as we used to think old was anymore. We have 80-year-olds who will have the metabolism of a 60-year-old. We have 50-year-olds who didn't do anything because we have a more sedentary lifestyle in our world. They may have some of those effects a little bit earlier. Inadequate long-term supervision. You know, I have to put my own little pill bottles together. You know, little flip things they take in the morning, take in the afternoon, that they get in there wrong. So if no one's supervising that, it becomes a problem. And then adherence to the drugs. You know, old people sometimes don't know how many times they've gone to bed in a day. So they don't even know if, did I just sleep 3 times on Monday and it's still Monday? Which just changes everything about it. They get up, they eat a little bit, that wears out, so they go back to bed. But that's the lifestyle for them. As we look at drugs, for every drug we carry on an ambulance, it's your responsibility to understand that drug. And you should know the drug names, and by names I mean common trades and mostly generics. You should know the classifications. What kind of drugs are these? Are these beta blockers? Are they bronchodilators? Are they smooth muscle relaxants? And remember, there could be multiple ones. You need to know its mechanism of action. What does it do? How does it affect the body? Because that may be something that you want to look at things and say, wait a minute, this guy's got a problem with that. Why would I want to give this drug right now? It may be the contraindication that tells us not to give that drug. Indications, what are we using for? Different than mechanism of action. I have a drug that opens up the bronchi. Well, that may not necessarily be what I want. Indications are I need to give it for certain conditions. Pharmacokinetics is
How the drug works.
how can I give it, which is part of the routes of administration, remember the absorption. How does it metabolize? How does it come back out? Anything there that I have to worry about with that particular drug. We have a drug, it's a gas, very seldom used anymore, called nitrous oxide. It was a really interesting gas, with great pain relief. You had the person put the mask on, they sucked it in, they sucked in nitrous oxide, all the pain went away, they got really giggly, they exhaled the nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide comes back out totally unchanged. It comes out as nitrous oxide. Quite often, if that ambulance was completely well sealed, the guy in the back was having a really good time with the patient. You know, really need to know how to open a window or get really close to your patient so it affects faster. What side and adverse effects can we expect from a drug? Again, what routes? Can you give it multiple routes? Can you give this drug IM, IO, sub-Q, IM, intranasal, buccal, or buccal? How's it supplied? What do you need to know how a drug's supplied?
Concentration.
Well, concentration will be one. Actually, sometimes it comes in different concentrations. We have Epi 1 to 1,000, we have Epi 1 to 10,000. Little bottle, big box. We need to know that so that we know what we're looking for. We also need, when someone says, get the nitro, don't go looking through the bags of IV fluid. Okay, you'll know what it looks like and how it's prepared. You need to know the dosages, because all drugs may have different dosages for different things. We can give epinephrine for asthma, we can give epinephrine for allergic reactions, we can give epinephrine as a drip in bradycardia, we give it in all cases of cardiac arrest for no proven reason whatsoever. That's about to go away, I hope. What's a contraindication?
When you don't give it.
When you don't give it. And I love the logic behind writing up all the information on drugs. It will tell you this drug is used to treat hypertension. A contraindication is do not use in hypertension. Okay. Sometimes if it's not indicated, it shouldn't even be a contraindication. For it to be contraindicated, it has to have an indication. Special considerations, any drug things you can't give it with, any times that you have to be careful with the drug. Should you give it fast? Should you give it slow? Do you want to give it through a normal saline IV or through another IV? Diazepam is one of those that really needs to go strictly through a normal saline IV. Back when we used to have D5W IVs, back when we had a lot of Ringer's IVs, it would actually crystallize in those fluids. So it had to be in the more watery solution so that it would work right. And then interactions, can you give it with other drugs? Or in some cases, foods that they've just recently. All right, so that's all the stuff with pharmacodynamics. Anybody got any concerns or worries about that stuff? Right off the top of your head. I know you're going to study significantly over the weekend to find all your problems. Anything confusing you so far? No? Okay. Why don't you give them